47 aerospace engineers. 11 months. Millions of dollars burned through like jet fuel on a cold runway. And not a single one of them could figure out what was wrong with that helicopter. But every Tuesday and Thursday, a man in a gray maintenance uniform walked past that grounded machine and knew exactly what was killing it. He just wasn't anyone important enough to ask. This is a story about what happens when the wrong people get ignored for too long, and what it costs everyone when pride finally runs out of road. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The helicopter had been sitting on the roof of Hargrove Tower for so long that the maintenance crew had started calling it the statue. Not with any particular affection, more the way you nickname something that's become a problem you've learned to live around. A broken elevator, a leaking ceiling tile, a 42-foot twin-engine executive helicopter worth approximately $9 million that hadn't left its landing pad in nearly a year. Chicago in early March was doing what Chicago always does, which is to say it was being genuinely unreasonable about the weather. The wind off Lake Michigan came in sideways at 23 miles per hour, and the temperature sat at a mean, deliberate 28 degrees. The kind of cold that doesn't just touch you, but finds its way into the seams of your coat, the gap between your collar and your neck, the thin skin over your knuckles. The kind of cold that reminds you, without any sentimentality, that this city was not built for human comfort. It was built for commerce, for ambition, for people who didn't have time to complain about the weather because they had meetings in 17 minutes, and the traffic on Michigan Avenue was already a disaster. On the 58th floor of Hargrove Tower, Vanessa Sterling was having the worst Tuesday of a year, already full of bad Tuesdays. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her corner office with a cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink, staring at nothing in particular while her executive assistant, a 26-year-old named Derek, who was constitutionally incapable of delivering good news, waited for her to say something. "Say it again," Vanessa said. Her voice was flat. Not angry. Not yet. Flat the way a road is flat before a cliff. Derek consulted his tablet, though he'd memorized every word of the report. Looking at the screen gave him somewhere else to put his eyes. Meridian Aerospace submitted their final diagnostic this morning. Their team spent 9 days on the aircraft. Full systems review, fuel line inspection, avionics diagnostic, structural assessment. I know what a diagnostic is, Derek. Right, sorry. Their conclusion is... He cleared his throat. Their conclusion is consistent with the previous 46 assessments. No identifiable mechanical defect. No electrical fault. No structural compromise. The aircraft, according to Meridian's chief engineer, is, and this is a direct quote, in exceptional condition for its age and usage history. Vanessa turned from the window. She was 30 years old. People who didn't know her assumed she was older, not because she looked worn, but because she carried herself with the particular stillness of someone who had learned, young and through difficulty, that showing your reaction too quickly was a kind of weakness you couldn't afford. She'd inherited Sterling Logistics at 26 when her father had his first stroke, and she'd spent the 4 years since then doing what everyone said couldn't be done. Turning a company hemorrhaging contracts and bleeding talent into one of the 10 largest private logistics operations in the Midwest. She had done this by being precise, by being unsentimental, by making decisions quickly and trusting the right people and cutting loose the wrong ones without ceremony. The helicopter had made her feel like none of that was true. Exceptional condition, she repeated. Yes. An aircraft in exceptional condition that has not flown in 11 months. That's... Derek hesitated. That's the situation, yes. 47 engineers, Vanessa said. Not loudly, almost to herself. Do you know what we've paid out in diagnostic fees, consultation retainers, and specialist travel expenses in the last 11 months? Derek knew. He wished he didn't. $2.3 million. The number sat in the air between them like smoke. Vanessa set her coffee cup down on the edge of her desk. Not carefully, just down, the way you put something down when you've stopped caring about it, and walked to her desk chair. She sat. She opened the Meridian report on her computer screen and scrolled through it without reading it, because she'd read 31 of these reports, and they all said the same thing in different fonts. Get me Richard, she said. Toot. Richard Hale was Vanessa's Director of Aviation Operations, a title he'd held for 3 years, and which he currently wore like a man wearing a coat 2 sizes too large. He was 51 years old, 28 years of aviation experience, the kind of resume that looked magnificent on paper. He had managed flight operations for a Fortune 500 company in Dallas, consulted for 2 regional airlines, and once spent 18 months advising the Federal Aviation Administration on executive aviation safety protocols. He had absolutely no idea what was wrong with the helicopter. He appeared in Vanessa's office 11 minutes after Derek made the call, carrying his own copy of the Meridian report and wearing the expression of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say on the elevator ride up. "Before you say anything," Richard started. "I haven't said anything yet," Vanessa said. "Right, of course." He sat across from her. "Look, Meridian is the 5th Tier 1 firm we've brought in. At this point, we have to consider the possibility that there is no diagnosable mechanical issue, that what we're dealing with is an intermittent condition, something that only manifests under very specific operating parameters that we haven't been able to replicate in a controlled inspection environment." Vanessa looked at him. "That's what you've been telling me for 8 months, Richard." "Because it's still the most logical." "What's not logical?" Vanessa said, and now the flatness in her voice was gone, replaced with something quieter and colder than anger, "is that I'm running a logistics company where the CEO cannot use her own aircraft. Do you understand what that means operationally? I flew commercial to the Castellano meeting in New York last month. Commercial. I sat in first class next to a man who spent the entire flight watching videos on his phone without headphones. That is what $2.3 million and 47 engineers has gotten me." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. He was smart enough to know when a sentence wasn't going to help him. "What are our options?" Vanessa said. It wasn't a question, it was a directive to present her options so she could pick one and be done with it. Richard exhaled. "We could commission another round of diagnostics. There are 2 firms we haven't used yet. How much?" "Combined, probably another 400,000. "What else?" "We could put the aircraft up for sale. As is, a $9 million machine in exceptional mechanical condition." He chose not to reference the Meridian quote directly. "Would realistically sell for somewhere between 4 and 5 million on the secondary market, given the mystery surrounding it. We take a $4 million loss. Or we could—" Richard paused. This was the part he'd rehearsed least, because it was the part that felt most like surrender. "We could write it off. Permanently ground it. It becomes a very expensive maintenance line item until we decide what to do with it structurally." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Chicago was doing its thing. Somewhere down on the street, 58 stories below, there were people who would have considered $2.3 million a sum beyond imagination. Up here, it was just a number attached to a problem that wouldn't go away. "There has to be something we're missing," she said, not with frustration, with the particular quality of someone who refuses to accept an answer that doesn't make sense. Richard Hale, to his limited credit, had been thinking the same thing for months. The trouble was he'd run out of places to look. Mason Brooks did not think about the helicopter all the time. That would have been the more dramatic version of the story. The one where the quiet, overlooked genius spends his days burning with suppressed knowledge, counting the days until someone finally asks the right person the right question. That wasn't Mason. Mason had too much else going on to nurse a preoccupation about an aircraft that wasn't his problem. What Mason thought about, most of the time, was his daughter. Lily was 7 years old, and she was at that age where she had developed very firm opinions about things and was not shy about sharing them. She had opinions about which brand of peanut butter was acceptable. One was not, and she would explain at length why if given the opportunity. She had opinions about the correct order in which to do homework. Math first, reading second, spelling last because spelling was kind of a punishment. She had opinions about her father's coffee, which she had not tasted but was confident smelled like what sadness would smell like if sadness had a smell. She also had a stopwatch. It was a small digital thing, yellow with a cracked casing because she'd dropped it twice, given to her by Mason's mother when Lily had expressed an interest in timing things. This had led to a phase of approximately 3 weeks where Lily timed everything. How long it took to eat breakfast. 9 minutes, 42 seconds, unless there were eggs, in which case it took longer because she ate eggs one bite at a time in a specific rotation. How long it took her father to get from the parking garage to the lobby of Hargrove Tower. 4 minutes and 8 seconds if he walked normally, 3 minutes and 1 second if he walked fast. How long certain things took to happen. She was, Mason thought, going to be an engineer, or a scientist, or possibly a very demanding project manager, something that involved precision and accountability. On the mornings when school started late, or when Lily had a break between sessions at her after-school program, she came to work with Mason. Not because Mason had no other childcare option. He had his mother, he had a neighbor who'd offered a dozen times. He had a network of good people who would have helped. He brought Lily because she liked it, and because Mason, who had learned in the hardest way possible that time was not a renewable resource, didn't pass up opportunities to spend it with his daughter when he could help it. Hargrove Tower's facilities management team had not exactly welcomed this arrangement when Mason had first raised it. The building manager, a humorless man named Gerald Kwan, had quoted 3 different sections of the employee handbook at Mason in a single conversation. But Mason had been patient in the particular way of someone who has been patient through genuinely difficult things and does not find bureaucratic friction especially threatening. And eventually, an informal accommodation had been reached. Lily could come on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She had to stay within designated areas unless accompanied by her father, and she was required to wear a visitor badge that was almost comically large on her 7-year-old frame. Lily wore the badge with pride. She had named it Gerald after the building manager because she thought this was funny. Mason had told her that was disrespectful. She had said, "I know," in a tone that made it clear she understood what disrespect was and had made a calculated decision. Mason had decided to let that one go. He had been doing maintenance work at Hargrove Tower for 4 years. Before that, 12 years in the United States Army, specializing in rotary wing aircraft maintenance, which was the technical way of saying he fixed helicopters. A lot of helicopters, in places that were not Chicago and were considerably less forgiving of mechanical errors. He had a gift for it. Not in the vague, complimentary way people describe gifts when they mean someone is reasonably competent, in the specific, observable way where other people who knew the field would watch him work and get quiet because there was something in the way he diagnosed a problem that went beyond procedure. He didn't just follow the checklist. He listened to the machine. He understood systems the way some people understand languages, not by translating word for word, but by feeling the shape of meaning before the words came. His commanding officer, a woman named Colonel Patricia Drew, who did not give compliments unless she meant them precisely, had told him once that he had the best diagnostic instinct she'd seen in 20 years of aviation operations. She had been trying to convince him to extend his service. He had thanked her and declined. That had been 4.5 years ago, 5 months after his wife Elena had died. Mason did not, as a rule, think about Elena in the middle of the workday. He had learned to compartmentalize the way veterans learn to compartmentalize, not by suppressing grief, but by assigning it a time and a place. He thought about her in the evenings, when Lily was asleep, in the particular quiet of a small apartment that still sometimes felt too large for 2 people. He thought about her on the anniversary of things. He thought about her when Lily did something Elena would have found hilarious, which happened more often than Mason could have predicted. He did not think about her when he was working. Working was what he had when he wasn't being a father. He was good at it, and it was his. What he did on his Tuesday and Thursday rounds, when his inspection path took him through the stairwell access to the building's rooftop helipad, was glance at the helicopter the way you glance at something you've already figured out. Not with particular frustration or urgency, just with the low, persistent awareness of a problem in a place where he had no authority to solve it. Well, the first time he'd seen the aircraft grounded, it had been a Wednesday afternoon in April of the previous year. He'd been on the roof to inspect the HVAC drainage systems, a glamorous part of the job, and the helicopter had been sitting there with a team of 3 technicians crawling around it wearing Dawson Aerospace uniforms and expressions of professional concern. Mason had done what he always did when he encountered people working on something in his building. He'd assessed without interfering. He'd watched the Dawson team run their diagnostics for about 4 minutes before he'd understood what he was looking at. The aircraft was a Sikorsky S-76D, the executive configuration, which Mason knew intimately because he'd worked on 3 of them during a particularly complicated rotation at Fort Campbell. Beautiful machines, sophisticated fuel management systems that communicated with the engine management computers in ways that, under certain very specific and rare conditions, could create a vapor lock scenario in the primary fuel feed that was genuinely difficult to detect because it resolved itself when the system cooled down. It was, Mason had thought that Wednesday afternoon in April, an extremely elegant problem. Rare enough that most technicians would never encounter it. Invisible in a cold system diagnostic. Completely obvious to anyone who'd seen it before. He had picked up his clipboard and continued his inspection. The thing about working maintenance in a building full of executives is that you develop a peculiar relationship with invisibility. Not the dramatic kind. Not the invisibility of a person being actively ignored or mistreated, though that happened too, in small ways. The eyes that slid past you in the elevator. The conversations that continued as if you hadn't entered the room. More the functional invisibility of a person whose presence is assumed to be entirely contextual. When you were fixing something, you were the person fixing it. When you weren't, you were part of the background. You moved through spaces that other people occupied without quite entering those spaces yourself. Mason had made his peace with this a long time ago. He was not by nature someone who needed to be seen. He'd grown up in a household where his father had worked 31 years as a pipe fitter without ever once appearing in the company newsletter, and he understood that there was a whole category of work, essential, skilled, irreplaceable, that existed outside the frame of recognition. That was all right. Recognition was not the same as worth. What Mason didn't love, and he was honest with himself about this in the way that people who are fundamentally fair-minded are honest about the things that bother them, was the assumption of ignorance that often came with invisibility. The assumption that because you were not in the meeting, you did not understand what was being discussed in the meeting. That because your role was operational rather than executive, your observations about operations were somehow less valid. He had watched, over the course of 11 months, as a procession of aviation firms sent their people to the roof of Hargrove Tower. He'd been up there sometimes when they were working. He'd watched them run their diagnostics with the systematic thoroughness of people who knew exactly what they were looking for, which was precisely the problem, because what they were looking for was a standard mechanical failure, and what the helicopter had was not that. Not once had anyone asked him if he had any thoughts. He hadn't offered any either. And if he examined this honestly, which he did, occasionally, in the evenings when Lily was doing homework and he had a moment to think, he could see that there was some stubbornness in his silence, some quiet, maybe unflattering insistence on being asked rather than volunteering. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of 4 years of being background. Maybe it was simply the knowledge that walking up to a team of Meridian aerospace engineers and saying, "Hey, I think I know what that is," was not a sentence that was likely to produce useful results. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment. He told himself, less charitably, that he was probably also waiting for someone to look at him long enough to see that there might be something worth asking. On the Thursday morning that changed things, Lily was with him because she had a half day at school, and Mason's mother had a dentist appointment, and everything aligned in the particular logistical way that characterized single parenthood, where your schedule was less a plan and more a series of contingencies responding to other contingencies. Lily was carrying her stopwatch and her school backpack, which contained her homework folder, a book about deep-sea creatures she'd checked out of the library. "Did you know there are fish that make their own light, Dad? It's called bioluminescence. I've been practicing saying it." And a granola bar that she'd already decided she was going to eat on the elevator. "You can't eat on the elevator," Mason said. "Why not?" "Building policy." "Gerald's policy?" "The building's policy." Lily considered this. Gerald seems like someone who would make a rule about granola bars. Mason did not say that he agreed with this assessment because he was trying to be a responsible parent. They came out of the stairwell onto the roof at 9:47 in the morning, and Mason registered immediately that something was different. There were people up here. Not another inspection team. He'd have been notified, but a small cluster of individuals in expensive coats standing near the helicopter. He recognized Richard Hale, the aviation director, From the brief moment 3 months ago when Richard had appeared on the roof during a Westbrook avionics inspection and introduced himself to Mason by not introducing himself to Mason and talking around him to the inspection lead. Standing next to Richard was a woman Mason recognized without having ever spoken to, because her photograph was on the company website and in the lobby on the floor dedicated to Hargrove Tower's anchor tenant. Vanessa Sterling. Younger in person than her photographs managed to convey, or maybe it was that the photographs had been taken in the particular still, curated way of executive portraits, and the person standing on a cold rooftop in March, with the wind doing very unkind things to her coat, was more dimensional than that. She looked, Mason thought, like someone who had been told 11 months of bad news and had arrived today to be told some more. Lily took his hand and stayed close, the way she did when she wasn't sure about a new situation. She kept the granola bar in her pocket. Richard Hale saw Mason first. There was a beat, brief, unmistakable, where Richard processed Mason's presence the way he always processed Mason's presence, which was as a logistical element. The maintenance guy was here. Fine, he was probably here to check something. The timing was inconvenient but not catastrophic. Then something shifted in Richard's expression. Mason had seen this particular shift before in people. The moment where they stop seeing the background and start seeing a possibility. It was not always flattering to be the subject of that moment, because it meant they hadn't been seeing you clearly before. But it also meant something might finally happen. "Brooks," Richard said, not warmly, but directly. "You were Army aviation, right?" "Helicopters." "Yes, sir." "How long?" 12 years, fixed wing and rotary, mostly rotary." Richard glanced at Vanessa, then back at Mason. There was something uncomfortable in his expression, the particular discomfort of a man who is considering a concession. "Have you ever worked on the S-76? Mason looked at the helicopter, then back at Richard. 3 of them. Vanessa Sterling had been watching this exchange without expression. Now she spoke for the first time, and her voice was not what Mason had expected. Not the warm, performed executive tone of someone managing a public moment, but the flat, pragmatic voice of someone who was tired and had stopped performing. "What's your name?" "Mason Brooks." "Do you know what's wrong with my helicopter, Mr. Brooks?" It was, Mason thought, a very direct question. He appreciated that. He'd spent 11 months wishing someone would ask it. "Yes," he said. "I do." "Check." Vanessa Sterling stared at him for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Behind her, Richard Hale made a sound that was not quite a word. One of the 2 other people on the roof, a younger woman with a tablet who was presumably someone's assistant, looked up from her screen. "You know," Vanessa said, slowly. Each word placed separately, the way you place items on a scale you're not sure will hold them. "Yes. You've known." There was something in her voice that wasn't anger yet, but was adjacent to it. The pressure that builds before temperature converts to something else. Mason had heard that quality in voices his entire career. He didn't take it personally. "I had a strong suspicion from the first time I saw the diagnostic teams on the roof," he said. "I can't know with complete certainty until I run a specific test, but based on the aircraft model, the symptom profile, and the conditions..." He paused. He wanted to be precise here. He'd been waiting 11 months to be precise. "I'm confident." "And you didn't say anything." It was the obvious question. Mason had thought about how he'd answer it, if it ever came up. He'd thought about several versions. The diplomatic one, the direct one, the one that laid out exactly what it's like to be invisible in your own building and watch people spend money on problems you could see the solution to. He settled on the version that was simply true. "No one asked me," he said. The wind moved across the rooftop. Somewhere below, the city was going about its business, indifferent to what was happening 58 floors up. Vanessa held his gaze, and then, for just a moment, something crossed her face that was not the executive composure she'd maintained through this entire conversation. Something that looked, if Mason was reading it right, like the very early, still mostly suppressed first signal of shame. "What's wrong with it?" she said. Mason glanced at the helicopter. He reached into his work bag, the structured, worn canvas bag he'd carried since his army days, and pulled out a notepad and a pen that didn't work, replaced it with one that did, and wrote 3 words. He tore the page out and handed it to her. Fuel vapor lock. Vanessa looked at the paper. That's been ruled out. Every cold system diagnostic, Mason said. They inspect it when it's been sitting in open air for hours, sometimes overnight, before they start. By then, the vapor condition has resolved. You'd need a specific startup sequence, under a specific temperature window, with the fuel system at a specific saturation level. If none of those line up at the same time, the diagnostic comes back clean every time. Richard Hale stepped forward. Meridian's chief engineer has 30 years. 30 years and never worked in S-76D in a high-altitude cold environment, Mason said. Not unkindly, just accurately. This particular issue is documented in service bulletins from 2019. It affects a small percentage of aircraft with the updated fuel management controller. It's rare enough that most technicians have never seen it. Silence. Lily, who had been standing very still beside her father, holding her stopwatch in one hand and his sleeve in the other, looked up at the helicopter with the assessing expression she got when she was determining how interesting something was. Vanessa looked at Mason, at his uniform, at his tool bag, at the 7-year-old beside him. Then she said the thing that, in any other version of this moment, might have stayed in the private register of her thoughts. You're a maintenance technician. It was not technically a question, but it functioned like one. The kind that exists less to request information and more to make explicit something the speaker already knows, often as a way of processing the distance between expectation and reality. Yes, ma'am, Mason said. I am. And you're telling me that 47 aerospace engineers missed something you identified in... She stopped. How long did it take you to identify it? Mason thought about it honestly. The first time I saw the aircraft? About 4 minutes? No one said anything. Of course, Vanessa said, and now there was something in her voice that was not flatness but its opposite, a kind of restrained, directed energy. 4 minutes. Richard started to say something. She held up a hand without looking at him, and he stopped. Can you fix it? She asked Mason. Yes. How long will it take? This was the part Mason had been thinking about since the first Wednesday he'd seen the Dawson team on the roof. He'd run through it in his head so many times that it had stopped feeling like an estimate and started feeling like a memory. 3 minutes, he said. The silence this time was different, thicker. 3 minutes, Vanessa repeated. If I'm right about what I think it is, yes. Richard Hale laughed. It wasn't the mean version. He wasn't that kind of person. But it was the involuntary laugh of a man whose professional brain had simply rejected an incoming piece of information. The last team spent 9 days. The last team was looking for a mechanical defect, Mason said. They weren't wrong to look. They were thorough. But there isn't a mechanical defect. There's a vapor condition in the primary fuel feed that's managed by recalibrating the engine management software and manually clearing the system in a specific sequence. If the condition is what I think it is, 3 minutes is actually generous. Lily tugged his sleeve. He looked down. Can I time it? She asked. He studied her for a moment. If Ms. Sterling says it's okay. Every adult on the rooftop looked at the 7-year-old with the yellow, cracked stopwatch. Vanessa Sterling, who was 30 years old and had inherited a company and turned it around and sat through 11 months of engineering reports that all said the same useless thing, looked at this little girl with her stopwatch and her backpack and her small, utterly serious face. What's your name? Vanessa asked. Lily Brooks. How old are you, Lily? 7 3/4. A beat. The 3/4 are important. Something happened in Vanessa's expression that she didn't quite control. Not a smile. Too complicated for a smile. More like something opening slightly in a face that had been held very closed. Yes, Vanessa said. You can time it. Mason opened his tool bag on the tarmac of the helipad and considered what he was looking at. The S-76D sat there in the March morning wind with the particular mute patience of a machine that has been waiting. The rotors were locked and covered. The engine housings were closed. It looked from the outside like an aircraft in exceptional condition, which it technically was. The problem had never been anything you could see from the outside. He thought about the service bulletin. He thought about the 2 aircraft he'd worked this exact issue on at Fort Campbell, the first time 4 years ago and the second time 18 months later. He thought about the sequence, the order in which the steps had to be done, because order mattered here more than in most repairs. You couldn't shortcut the sequence. You had to do it right. He did not think about who was watching. He'd learned that too, a long time ago. The work went better when it was just the work, not the judgment around the work, not the stakes attached to the work, not the $2.3 million of failed attempts that preceded the work. Just what the machine needed, in what order, approached with attention and without performance. He crouched at the engine access panel on the starboard side and opened it. "You need us to—" Richard began. "I need it quiet," Mason said. "Please." Richard closed his mouth. Mason looked at the fuel management controller. He looked at the fuel feed lines. He looked at the specific junction that, in the 2019 service bulletin, had been flagged as the potential origin point for the vapor accumulation. Everything looked clean. Everything looked correct, which was exactly what you'd see if it was this particular problem. He reached into his bag and withdrew a small diagnostic connector, the kind of tool that looked absurdly simple for the function it performed, and interfaced with the engine management computer's secondary port. Numbers scrolled on the small display screen. He felt Lily move slightly behind him, craning to see. He heard the small click of her stopwatch. She hadn't started it yet. She was waiting. She understood somehow that he hadn't started yet. He hadn't told her when to start. She just knew. 7 years old, he thought, and she already gets it. The numbers on the display told him what he needed to know. A fuel pressure differential. Small, periodic, the kind of thing that would barely register in a routine scan, between the primary and secondary feed lines. Not enough to flag as a fault. Exactly the signature of vapor accumulation in the primary line junction. "There you are. Starting now," he said quietly. He heard the click. What happened in the next 2 minutes and 58 seconds was not dramatic. That was the thing that would probably not translate well to the accounts that came later. The people on the roof telling the story in meetings, in hallways, to their families over dinner. Because the story they'd tell would inevitably reach for the dramatic, for the expert at work in the crisis, for the cinematic version of competence. The reality was quiet. Mason manually bled the primary fuel feed line at the accumulation point, releasing the vapor pocket with the careful deliberation of someone who knows that the only way to do this right is to do it slowly. He watched the pressure differential on his display screen equalize. He disconnected the diagnostic connector and accessed the engine management software through the main avionics panel, navigating to the fuel system calibration menu, and entered the correction sequence from the service bulletin. 3 parameter adjustments that told the computer how to manage fuel pressure during startup in cold, high-altitude conditions. He closed the access panels in order. He checked his connections. He stood up. "Start it," he said. Vanessa Sterling had not moved from the spot where she'd been standing. She looked at Mason, then at the helicopter, then at Mason. He made the smallest gesture toward the cockpit. She walked to the helicopter. She'd flown it herself when it had been operational. It was her aircraft, and she held a pilot's certificate, though she rarely flew it solo for operations. She climbed into the pilot's seat. Richard moved to assist her with the startup checklist. She waved him off with a slight motion that suggested she'd done this enough times to not need help with the checklist. She ran through the pre-flight sequence. She engaged the starters. There was a moment, the fraction of a second between startup initiation and engine response, that, on a machine that has failed to start for 11 months, stretches. Every person on the roof felt it stretch. Even Richard Hale, who had spent the last 10 minutes trying to arrange his face into skeptical but open-minded, felt his breath stop in that fraction of a second. Then both turbines caught. Not hesitatingly, not with the coughing, reluctant, intermittent response of an engine with a real problem coming back to life. They caught cleanly, the power rising through the characteristic pitch sequence of a Sikorsky startup, The system's lights cycling from warning amber to operational green, the rotor brake releasing, the massive blades beginning their slow rotation and accelerating. The helicopter, which had been called worthless scrap not 2 hours ago in an executive conference call, began to sound like a helicopter. Every warning light cleared. The engine management display read normal. On the rooftop of Hargrove Tower, in the March cold, with the Chicago wind tearing past at 23 miles per hour, the $9 million machine that 47 engineers couldn't fix was running. Lily looked at her stopwatch. 2 minutes and 58 seconds, she announced. She said it the way you say something that you've been waiting to say, and that turns out to feel exactly as good as you thought it would. Then she looked at her father and gave him the particular small nod that was her highest form of approval. Mason crouched down and she came into his arms. He held her for a moment, just long enough. And then he stood up and looked at Vanessa Sterling, who was sitting in the cockpit of a running helicopter, staring at the instrument panel with an expression he couldn't fully read from where he stood. She shut down the engines. She climbed out. She stood on the helipad and she looked at Mason Brooks, and she was quiet long enough that the wind filled the silence around them. When she spoke, her voice had changed in a way that was small but perceptible. Something in the register of it. Something that sounded less like the person who had dismissed him in a sentence 20 minutes ago and more like a person who was recalibrating. "Thank you," she said. It was 2 words. Simple, direct, not decorated. Mason nodded. He started putting his tools back in his bag. Well, he didn't know then. Standing on the roof, zipping his tool bag, Lily beside him already, back to examining the stopwatch display with focused interest. What would come next? He didn't know about the office conversation, the job offer, the unexpected directions that were about to change the shape of his week, and then his year, and then his life. He wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking that the helicopter had been fixed in 2 minutes and 58 seconds. He was thinking that Lily had been the one timing it. He was thinking that he would tell his mother about this tonight, and she would laugh the way she laughed when things that were clearly ridiculous were also clearly right. He was thinking that the machine had needed exactly what he thought it needed, and that had felt, as it always did, like a kind of conversation, like being understood. He picked up his bag. "You ready?" he said to Lily. She looked at the helicopter, then at her father, then back at the helicopter. "It's a good one," she said. Mason looked at the aircraft, fully powered down now, just sitting there in the cold like it had always been fine, like it had been fine all along, just waiting for the right question. And he almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "It is." Vanessa Sterling did not go directly back to her office. She stood on that rooftop for another 3 minutes after Mason Brooks and his daughter disappeared through the stairwell door, the wind working at her coat, the helicopter sitting behind her in its usual silence, except it wasn't the same silence anymore. It had been, 20 minutes ago, the silence of something broken. Now it was the silence of something that had simply been turned off, which was an entirely different thing, and the distinction mattered in a way she was still trying to work out. Richard Hale stood a few feet away, not speaking. He had the quality, in this particular moment, of a man who has learned through experience that the most useful thing he can do is be quiet. His assistant, Jenny, had already retreated to the stairwell, sensing correctly that whatever was happening in Vanessa's expression was not something that required an audience. Finally, Vanessa turned around. "How long has he worked in this building?" she asked. "Brooks?" Richard considered this with the careful speed of a man aware that his next several sentences needed to be calibrated correctly. 4 years, I believe, maybe a little more. He came up from facilities management. He handles the mechanical systems on floors 20 through 38, plus the rooftop utilities. And his background? Army, he said. 12 years rotary wing aviation. I had no idea. Richard started and then appeared to decide against finishing that sentence. "No," Vanessa said. "Neither did I." She pulled her coat tighter and walked to the stairwell door. Richard followed at a respectful distance. Neither of them spoke again until they were in the elevator, the doors closed, the building swallowing them back into its usual logic of floors and meetings and things that made sense. Then Vanessa said, "Pull his personnel file." I want to see it before the end of today. Richard nodded. He typed a note on his phone with one thumb, the way men in his position typed notes, with the performative diligence of someone ensuring their response was being recorded. Vanessa watched the floor numbers descend. She was thinking about 4 minutes. How long it had taken Mason Brooks, the first time he'd seen the aircraft, to identify a problem that had cost her company $2.3 million and 11 months. She was thinking about the word asked. No one asked me. And the way he'd said it, not with bitterness or accusation, but with the plain, straightforward quality of a true statement. She was thinking about how she would have answered that if she'd been him. She didn't love the answer she was arriving at. The elevator opened on the 58th floor. Derek was waiting with the expression he always wore when something had happened that required immediate management. Eyes slightly wider than usual, standing close enough to the elevator bank to suggest urgency, but not close enough to suggest panic. He'd clearly already received some version of events from Jenny. "Before you say anything," Vanessa said, stepping off the elevator and moving toward her office without breaking stride. "I need 45 minutes with no calls, no interruptions, and a fresh cup of coffee, because the first one is a crime scene." Derek fell into step beside her. The Renfield group called again. "They want to confirm the Thursday logistics review." "Confirm it." "And there's a message from the building's general management. Apparently some concern was raised about unauthorized personnel accessing the rooftop outside of scheduled inspection windows." Vanessa stopped walking. She turned and looked at Derek with an expression that made him take a small, involuntary step backward. "Who raised that concern?" she asked. Derek checked his phone. "A Mr. Gerald Kwan. He's the—" "I know who Gerald is," she resumed walking. "Tell Gerald that the personnel in question identified and resolved an 11-month equipment failure in under 3 minutes, and if he has additional concerns about rooftop access protocols, he is welcome to submit them in writing, and I will personally review them sometime in the next fiscal year." Derek typed this down verbatim. He would, Vanessa knew, significantly soften it before sending. This was one of the things she valued about Derek. She closed her office door behind her and stood for a moment in the quiet. The city stretched out below the windows, indifferent as always, doing its enormous thing. Somewhere in this building, Mason Brooks was probably back on his rounds, checking drainage systems or HVAC units or whatever Tuesday brought, carrying his worn canvas bag and the 11 months of knowing something no one had bothered to ask him about. She sat at her desk and pulled up his personnel file herself before Richard could send it. What the file told her was incomplete, the way personnel files are always incomplete. They contain the facts of a person without the person. Start date. Position history. Performance reviews which were uniformly positive in the careful hedged language of institutional documentation. Mr. Brooks continues to demonstrate strong technical proficiency. Work quality consistently meets and often exceeds departmental standards. Punctuality and reliability are exceptional. Exceptional. There was that word again. She found the emergency contact section. It listed one person, Carol Brooks. Relationship, mother. Below that, a notation that had apparently been added by HR during his initial onboarding. Employee has sole custody of one minor dependent, has requested flexibility for school schedule conflicts as needed. Approved per management discretion. She clicked through to the employment history section. Before Hargrove Tower, a single entry, listed as prior military service, with a date range suggesting he'd left the Army approximately 4.5 years ago. The position code was the standard civilian translation, aviation maintenance specialist. But the service record attached was not standard. It ran to 3 pages. She read enough of it to understand that Colonel Patricia Drew's commendation letters were not boilerplate. She read enough to understand that the Army had been very much aware of what it was losing when Mason Brooks took his discharge papers and went home to raise his daughter. She closed the file and called Richard. "I want a meeting," she said. "Today, this afternoon." "With Brooks?" There was a slight careful quality in Richard's voice that told her he'd been expecting this. "Yes." She looked at the window. "And Richard, I want it in my office. Not a conference room, not a HR space, my office. A beat. I'll set it up. And don't—" She paused. This part was harder to phrase in a way that didn't sound like what it was. Don't tell him what it's about. I want to be the one to do that. What Richard Hale did not tell Vanessa, because she hadn't asked, was that he had tried twice in the previous 4 months to quietly find out if Mason Brooks had any aviation background. Not in any official capacity, not in any way that might lead to an actual conversation, more in the tentative, institutional way of someone who suspects there might be a resource nearby and wants to assess it without committing to anything. He'd asked Jenny to pull the general employment records for anyone in building maintenance with specialized technical backgrounds. He'd scanned the list without seeing anything actionable, because Mason's record listed U.S. Army aviation maintenance in a field that, in the context of a building maintenance staff directory, looked like the kind of background that made you good at fixing HVAC systems, which it did, in fact, make you good at. Richard was not, at heart, a dishonest person. He was something more particular and arguably more problematic. He was a person who had spent 30 years in an industry where what mattered was credentials, certifications, the institutional weight of names on letterhead. Meridian Aerospace, Westbrook Avionics, Dawson Aerospace. These were names that, when attached to an assessment, carried authority. A building maintenance technician was not a name that carried authority, regardless of what 12 years in Army aviation might have actually produced in the person who'd lived it. He knew this was a failure of thinking. He knew it sitting in the elevator this morning, and he knew it with more clarity sitting at his desk this afternoon, typing the message asking Mason Brooks to come to Ms. Sterling's office at 3 o'clock. He hit send before he could think about it too much. Mason's shift phone buzzed at 1:47 while he and Lily were in the parking garage on level B2, where he was inspecting the exhaust ventilation system for a particulate count that Gerald Kwan had flagged as potentially out of compliance. This was the kind of task that was simultaneously more important than it sounded. Exhaust particulates in an enclosed parking structure were a genuine air quality issue, and less important than it sounded in the context of a morning where he'd fixed an aircraft that 47 engineers couldn't. He read the message twice, then handed his phone to Lily because she was better at reading small text at angles. "It says Ms. Sterling's office," Lily read. 3 o'clock. Reply to confirm. She handed it back. "Who's Ms. Sterling?" "The woman on the roof this morning." Lily considered this with the gravity she brought to significant information. "The helicopter lady." "Her building, yes." "Why does she want to talk to you?" Mason thought about this honestly. He had 2 or 3 ideas, and he wasn't sure which one was right. "I'm not sure," he said, which was true enough. "Should I come?" He looked at her. She was standing next to a concrete pillar in a parking garage, wearing her visitor badge with Gerald the name on it, completely unconcerned about where she was or what was happening, just present and attentive the way she always was. Something in his chest moved in the complicated way it moved when he looked at his daughter, and felt simultaneously proud and protective and aware of how much he couldn't control about what was coming. "You're going to wait in the lobby, reading room set," he said. "Mrs. Okafor is on front desk until 4. "Mrs. Okafor makes me spell things," Lily said, not complaining, reporting. "That's because your spelling needs work." "My spelling is fine." "You spelled necessary with 2 C's last week." "I still got the idea across," he pointed at her. "Lobby reading room." She sighed the sigh of someone choosing to accept a situation while registering their position on it, and went back to examining the ventilation grate. At 3 o'clock, Mason knocked on the open door of the 58th floor corner office and found Vanessa Sterling sitting behind a desk that was large without being ostentatious, in an office that looked like someone worked in it rather than someone who wanted you to know they worked in it. Files were stacked in a specific order that seemed to have an internal logic. There was a whiteboard on the side wall with what appeared to be a logistics timeline and notes in 3 different colors of marker. She was on the phone. She held up one finger. "Give me a minute," and pointed to the chair across from her desk. He sat. He did not look around the room the way some people look around a room when they're trying to figure out what it says about the person who occupies it. He was fairly sure he already had a working understanding of Vanessa Sterling. She finished the call in 2 sentences, put her phone face down on the desk, and looked at him with the directness he'd noticed on the roof, the quality of someone who thinks it's a waste of time to approach something indirectly. "I read your service record," she said. He was quiet for a beat. Okay. You left the Army 4.5 years ago. Yes. Why? It was a direct question. He could have given the indirect answer: personal reasons, family considerations, the version that satisfied the inquiry without letting it in. He found he didn't want to. My wife died, he said. Lily was 2. I needed to be home. Vanessa held his gaze. She didn't perform sympathy, didn't do the head tilt or the softened voice or any of the things people deployed in these moments out of habit rather than genuine response. She just acknowledged it with a brief nod that said she'd heard him and meant it. I'm sorry, she said. 2 words, same register as the thank you on the roof. Not decorated. He found he preferred that. Thank you. There was a pause that wasn't uncomfortable, just a moment of 2 people recalibrating after something real had entered the room. I want to apologize to you, Vanessa said. Mason waited. Not for the helicopter situation specifically, although that's part of it. I want to apologize for how I spoke to you this morning. She was looking directly at him. He noticed that she wasn't making it easy on herself. She wasn't softening the apology by framing it as a misunderstanding or a natural response to stress. I dismissed you in front of my staff based on your job title. I made assumptions about what you were capable of understanding before you said a single word. That was wrong. And it was also, as it turned out, spectacularly incorrect. The last 3 words held a slight, self-directed edge that might have been the beginning of being able to laugh at herself about it eventually. Not yet, but eventually. Mason looked at the window for a moment, then back at her. I'm not going to tell you it didn't land, he said, because it did. But I also think you were dealing with 11 months of dead ends, and people in that position look for the most logical explanation. I didn't look logical. That's, she stopped. That's generous. It's accurate, he said. They're not the same thing, but they're not mutually exclusive. She considered him for a moment in a way that was not assessment, or not only assessment, something more like recalibration. I want to offer you a position, she said. The room changed slightly in the way rooms change when the conversation turns a corner you weren't quite expecting. Director of Aviation Operations, Vanessa said, for the company. Full scope, flight operations, maintenance oversight, compliance, fleet management. Richard Hale will be transitioning to a consulting role at the end of Q2 anyway, which I wasn't planning to discuss publicly yet, but which is relevant. She paused. The salary is 3 times your current rate. Full benefits, obviously, and I want to be specific about this because it's not a talking point. I will structure the position with flexibility for your daughter's schedule built into the contract, not as a favor, as a term. Mason said nothing for a moment. He had thought on the elevator up about what this meeting might be. He'd landed on 2 possibilities: that she was going to offer some kind of bonus for the helicopter fix, or that there was going to be some kind of HR discussion about Lily's presence during the incident. He had not landed on this. You don't know me, he said. I know your service record. I know what I watched you do this morning. I know you identified a problem in 4 minutes that cost this company $2.3 million to not solve for 11 months. She said it the way people say things they've been thinking about for a while, with a flatness that belied the weight of the number. I'm aware those aren't the same as knowing you, but they're enough to have a conversation. You have a director of aviation operations. Richard identified a problem for 3 years and never solved it. He's competent at the operational management side. He has no diagnostic ability and limited technical depth. Those things matter for what I need this role to be. Mason looked at his hands. He was still in his work uniform, gray with the Hargrove Tower Facilities logo on the chest, and he'd come directly from the parking garage inspection, which meant he probably smelled faintly of exhaust and degreaser. He was sitting in a corner office on the 58th floor of a Chicago skyscraper, being offered a director-level position by a 30-year-old CEO who'd seen him work for 3 minutes. He thought about Lily in the lobby reading room, probably spelling things for Mrs. Okafor. He thought about his mother, who had been telling him for 2 years that he was wasted in maintenance and who would have a very specific thing to say when he came home and told her about today. He thought about Colonel Drew, who had told him once, with the blunt affection of someone who rarely deployed affection in any form, that the worst thing that could happen to his talent was for it to go permanently unused. "I need to think about it," he said. Vanessa nodded. She'd expected this. He could see that she'd expected it. "How much time do you need?" "A week." "You have it." He stood. She stood. They were the same height, nearly. She might have had an inch on him, or maybe that was the desk. He extended his hand and she shook it, a solid, unremarkable handshake, the kind between two people who are still figuring out what the other one is. "Mr. Brooks?" she said as he was moving toward the door. He turned. "The service bulletin you mentioned. The 2019 one for the S-76D. I looked it up after you came down." She paused. "We should have had it flagged. It was in our maintenance database. Whoever set up the inspection protocols should have cross-referenced it against our aircraft model." She was not saying this to make him feel better. She was saying it as a diagnosis of a different kind of failure. We missed it at the system level before we ever missed it at the individual level. Mason thought about that. "That's a different problem to solve." "Yes," she said, "it is." He went to get his daughter. The conversation in Vanessa Sterling's office had taken 22 minutes. Lily had timed it. Not because anyone asked her to, but because timing things was her method of staying oriented when she wasn't sure how long she was supposed to wait. And Mrs. Okafor had eventually given up trying to make her spell things and had simply given her a piece of paper and a pen so she could write whatever she wanted. She'd written, "Dad fixed the helicopter. 2 minutes, 58 seconds. She'd drawn a picture of the helicopter underneath, with lines coming off it that were probably meant to represent rotors but looked more like sun rays. When Mason came off the elevator and walked across the lobby toward her, she showed him the paper. "Pretty good," he said. "What did the helicopter lady want?" He took her hand as they moved toward the exit. Through the glass doors, the March afternoon had softened slightly. Still cold, but the particular aggressive cold of the morning had settled into something more functional. "She offered me a different job," he said. Lily processed this. "What kind of job?" "A bigger one. Running the aviation stuff for the whole company." "But you like your job." He thought about this honestly. "I like doing good work. The job's been okay." "Would the new job be better?" "Maybe." He pushed the door open. The cold came in. "I have to think about it." Lily walked beside him toward the parking structure. After a while, she said, "Is it because of me? That you have to think about it?" Mason looked down at her. She was looking straight ahead, the way she looked when she asked something she'd been considering for a while and had decided she needed the real answer to. "Partly," he said. "I want to make sure whatever I do is good for both of us, not just for me." "I think you should do it," she said. "You don't even know what it is." "You fixed the helicopter in 2 minutes and 58 seconds, she said, with the conviction of someone presenting an evidence-based argument. "You should be doing helicopter stuff, not drain stuff." He was quiet for a moment. "Exhaust ventilation," he said. "Same thing." He almost smiled. She caught it, she always caught it, and allowed herself a small, satisfied expression. That evening, while Lily did homework at the kitchen table and Mason made dinner, the rice and vegetable thing he made 3 times a week because it was fast, and she ate it without complaint, which were the 2 primary criteria, he thought about what Vanessa Sterling had said toward the end of their conversation. Not the offer. The other thing. We missed it at the system level before we ever missed it at the individual level. It was an honest thing to say. It was also a kind of sophisticated thinking. The ability to see failure at its structural origin rather than just at its visible surface. He hadn't expected that from her, which was itself something to examine. He judged her the way she judged him, in the broad way you judge people when you only see them from one position. He wasn't sure what to make of that. He wasn't sure yet if it changed anything, but it was there, a small piece of information that didn't fit the simpler version of the day he'd been carrying around. He put the rice on low and leaned against the counter. "Dad?" Lily said, without looking up from her homework. "Yeah." "Can we go back to the helicopter sometime?" "Why?" She turned a page. "I want to see it fly." Across the city, in a condo in River North that cost enough per square foot to make most people's eyes go flat when she mentioned it, which she tried not to do, though she'd been unable to entirely shed the habit of transparency about money that came with growing up in it. Vanessa Sterling was sitting at her kitchen counter with a bowl of soup she was eating with the focused lack of attention of someone whose mind was entirely elsewhere. She'd called her father after the meeting with Mason Brooks. This was not something she did often. Gerald Sterling's first stroke had left him with limited speech and a patience for conversation that he carefully rationed, and Vanessa was disciplined about not wasting that patience on things he didn't need to hear. But she'd called him today because there were a small number of people she trusted with the version of herself that made mistakes, and he was one of them. She'd told him about the helicopter, about the 11 months, about Mason Brooks in his maintenance uniform with his daughter and her stopwatch. Her father had listened through most of it in silence. Then he'd said, in the careful way he spoke now, each word chosen and placed, "Did you apologize?" "Yes," she said. "Good." A pause. Was it enough? She thought about Mason Brooks' face when she'd apologized, the way he'd given her an honest accounting of why the mistake was understandable without absolving her of having made it, the way he'd accepted the apology without making her pay for it longer than necessary. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe." Her father made a sound that she'd learned over 30 years was his version of "that's the right answer." "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I offered him a job." Silence. Then, "Just the job?" Vanessa set her spoon down. "What do you mean?" Her father was quiet for a moment in the way of someone arranging words that were harder to say than they used to be. "Sometimes," he said, "when you've done something wrong, the response is the job, the promotion, the money. And sometimes that's right." A pause. "And sometimes it's also the easy way." Vanessa sat with that. "He said he needs to think about it," she said. "Smart man." She picked up her spoon, looked at her soup, put it back down. "There's a service bulletin," she said, "from 2019 for the aircraft model. It should have been in our inspection protocols. It wasn't." She paused. "I've been thinking about how many other things in our operations have the same problem. The right information exists somewhere, and nobody's connected it to the right process." "That," her father said, with the deliberateness that 2 years of speech therapy had given every sentence, "sounds like a company problem." "It is," Vanessa said. "I'm trying to figure out if Mason Brooks is the right person to help me fix it, or if I'm just rearranging the credit." "Both can be true," her father said. She nodded, though he couldn't see it. This was the thing about conversations with him that she missed in every conversation with anyone else, the way he could say something true without making it a verdict. "Eat your soup," he said. "It gets worse cold." She ate her soup. Richard Hale sent her a message at 8:47 that night, which was his way of flagging something while maintaining plausible professional decorum. "Regarding this afternoon, wanted to note that I made some inquiries earlier this year about staff with specialized technical backgrounds. Brooks' record didn't register as aviation specific in the way I was looking for. Wanted to flag that in the interest of transparency." Vanessa read the message twice. She typed, "I appreciate you telling me." Then she deleted that and typed, "Noted." Then she deleted that and put her phone face down. Richard was trying to tell her, in the careful language of someone managing his own accountability, that he'd looked in the right direction and missed it, which was both true and a kind of deflection, the institutional version of "I tried," just not quite enough. She understood the impulse. She deployed the same thing in different forms, in different situations. The report I commissioned, the firm I hired, the effort I made. The helicopter had been sitting on the roof the whole time. She turned her phone back over. She typed, "When you do the Q2 transition announcement, I'd like to discuss the language around your role change. I want to get it right." Richard replied in under a minute, "Of course. Thank you." She set her phone down. She went to her desk and opened the maintenance protocol database, the one that should have had the 2019 service bulletin flagged against the S76D's VYN number. She spent 40 minutes going through it, not looking for anything in particular, just looking at the shape of the system. Where the gaps were. What was connected to what, and what wasn't connected to anything. By the time she closed the laptop, it was after 10. She thought about Mason Brooks deciding whether to take the job. She thought about him at home right now, wherever home was, doing whatever single fathers did on Tuesday nights after days that had been significantly more unusual than expected. Helping his daughter with homework, making dinner, having the normal texture of a life that continued regardless of what had happened on a rooftop in the morning. She realized she hoped he'd say yes, not for the company, not as a corrective measure. She hoped he'd say yes because in 22 minutes in her office, Mason Brooks had said more precise, honest things than she'd heard from the people around her in months. And she didn't have enough of that. She'd had enough of people who were afraid of her, people who managed her, people who shaped their reports to protect their positions. She'd had enough of the $2.3 million version of everyone trying very hard and no one quite seeing the thing directly in front of them. She needed someone who would tell her when the problem was a vapor lock and everyone else was looking for a mechanical defect. Whether that was a good reason to offer someone a director-level position, she couldn't fully say. But it was an honest one. She turned off her desk lamp and went to bed. In a small apartment in Pilsen, Mason Brooks sat on the edge of his daughter's bed in the quiet after she'd fallen asleep. He did this sometimes, not every night, not in a ritual way, just occasionally, when the day had been significant enough that he needed a few minutes to be in the same room with the fact that she was okay, that they were both okay, that the ordinary shape of their life was intact. Lily slept the way she did everything, with complete commitment. She was entirely out, one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress, the yellow stopwatch on the nightstand next to her library book about bioluminescent fish. He sat with it for a while. The day, what it had been. He'd known for 11 months that he could fix the helicopter. He'd fixed it in 2 minutes and 58 seconds. He'd been offered a job that would triple his salary and come with a contract protecting the hours he needed to be Lily's father. And now he was sitting in the dark, thinking about whether to take it. The complicated thing was not what people might have assumed it was. It was not doubt about whether he could do the job. He knew he could. It was not fear of Vanessa Sterling or of the executive environment or of any of the things that constituted a significant professional change. Those were manageable. The complicated thing was this: his life, as it was, worked. It was tight and it was sometimes lonely, and it required more logistical management than he would ever have imagined a human life could require. But it worked. It was built around Lily, and it was stable, and he had learned to be careful about stability. He looked at the stopwatch. 2 minutes and 58 seconds. He thought about what Colonel Drew had said. He thought about what his mother would say. He thought about what Elena would have said, which he was always careful about. Not because it was painful exactly, but because he was aware that inventing her response to things was its own kind of indulgence, and he tried to use it sparingly. But tonight, here, Elena would have laughed at the whole thing. She would have laughed about the 47 engineers and the $2.3 million and the 7-year-old with the stopwatch, and then she would have looked at him with that specific look she had and said something like, "You're going to take the job, Mason. Stop pretending you're still deciding." He sat with that. Then he got up, turned off Lily's lamp, and went to do the dishes. He was going to take the job. He wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but he was going to take it. He called Richard Hale on Wednesday morning from the parking garage on level B1, where the cell reception was surprisingly decent, and the ambient noise of the ventilation system gave him the kind of privacy that didn't exist in the hallways or the maintenance office. "I've made a decision," Mason said. Richard was quiet for half a second, the half second of a man recalibrating his morning. "All right, I want to take the position, but I need some things in writing before I give a formal yes." "What kind of things?" "The flexibility clause. The one Ms. Sterling mentioned about Lily's schedule. I need that in the actual contract, not in a verbal assurance. Language specific enough that it survives a management change." "That's reasonable," Richard said, and Mason could hear him writing. "What else?" "I want to see the full aviation operations budget before I accept. Not a summary. The actual line items." He paused. "And I want 30 days before I formally transition out of maintenance. I have projects in progress, people I need to hand off to properly. Gerald's already going to have a complicated reaction to this. I'd rather not leave his team in a bad position. There was a longer pause this time. You want to protect Gerald Kwan's maintenance schedule. I want to do the job I currently have correctly until I'm done doing it, Mason said. That's different. Right. Another note. I'll bring this to Ms. Sterling this morning. I expect she'll find it acceptable. One more thing, Mason said. I don't want an announcement until everything's finalized. Not internal, not external. I'd rather tell my daughter before she hears about it from someone else. Richard said he understood, and Mason believed him, and they hung up. Mason stood in the parking garage for another moment, listening to the ventilation system hum with its steady industrial patience, and thought that this was probably the last time this particular sound would be a regular part of his day. He wasn't sure yet how he felt about that. He went back to work. Vanessa got Richard's summary of the conversation at 9:14 and read it twice standing in the hallway outside the conference room where she had a 10 o'clock she was already dreading. She forwarded it to her general counsel with a single line. Draft the contract. Get the flexibility language right. I want a lawyer who's actually thought about it, not boilerplate. Then she went into her meeting and spent the next hour talking about freight routing optimization for the Midwest corridor, which was important and necessary and required her full attention, and she gave it her full attention, because that was what she did. But underneath it, running like a secondary system, was the awareness that something had shifted in the building she was sitting in, that somewhere on floors 20 through 38, a man who had been fixing drainage systems was going to spend the next 30 days transitioning out of a job he'd been doing correctly for 4 years, and that his leaving was going to create a gap that her company's maintenance team was probably not fully prepared for. She made a note to ask Mason, before he started in his new role, if there was anyone on the maintenance staff he thought should be considered for advancement. Then she made a note to ask herself why it had taken an 11-month helicopter crisis and $2.3 million to get her to think about who was doing good work in the parts of her building she didn't walk through. She didn't like the answer. She wrote it down anyway. Thoughts. The 30 days were not quiet. Mason had anticipated a manageable transition, hand off his project list, document his maintenance protocols, have an awkward conversation with Gerald Kwan, finish out his schedule. He'd done operational transitions before. He'd handed off aircraft maintenance responsibilities in theater, under conditions that made a Chicago building management handoff look relaxed. He knew how to document a system. What he had not fully anticipated was Gerald. Gerald Kwan was not a bad person. Mason had worked under him for 4 years and had formed a clear picture of who he was. A man of intense procedural conviction who found comfort in compliance and experienced genuine distress when the system around him behaved unexpectedly. He managed the building maintenance team with the particular energy of someone who had decided that if everything followed the correct protocol, things would generally go right, and who found it difficult to process situations that demonstrated otherwise. The situation of Mason Brooks being offered a director-level position by the building's anchor tenant was, for Gerald, a situation that did not follow the correct protocol. He came to Mason's workstation on the 3rd day with a clipboard and an expression of focused anxiety. I need to understand the timeline, Gerald said. 30 days from Monday, Mason said. I'll have full documentation on every open project. You have 14 active maintenance responsibilities. 13. The B3 water pressure thing got resolved last week. Gerald made a note, though it was unclear what the note said. Who's taking over the rooftop utility systems? I'd recommend Terrence Williams. He's been cross-training on the rooftop HVAC for 8 months, and he's thorough. You should give him a formal bump in grade. He's been doing the work without the title for a while. Gerald wrote something. I'll review his file. Gerald, Mason said, and something in his voice made the other man look up. Terrence is good. Better than good. He just doesn't push for things. That doesn't mean he shouldn't have them. Gerald looked at Mason with the expression of a man receiving information he was simultaneously absorbing and resisting. I'm aware of Terrence's performance. I know you are, Mason said. Not challenging him, just making sure. Gerald left with his clipboard. 3 days later, Terrence Williams received a formal grade reclassification notice and a salary adjustment. He stopped by Mason's workstation to ask if Mason had said something. I just mentioned you were thorough, Mason said. Terrence looked at him for a moment. He was 28, from the South Side, 3 years with the building, the kind of worker who did more than his job description required without making a production of it. He had 4 younger siblings, and his mother's mortgage payment folded into his monthly budget, and he had never in 3 years asked Mason for anything other than technical guidance. "Thank you," Terrence said. "Don't thank me," Mason said. "You earned it. I just made sure someone was looking." Cool. On the 14th day of the transition, Vanessa's general counsel sent over the first draft of Mason's contract. He read it at his kitchen table after Lily went to bed, with a glass of water and his reading glasses that he wore only when he was alone, because Lily had told him once, with the honest cruelty of a 7-year-old, that they made him look like a confused professor. The contract was thorough. The salary was what Vanessa had said, 3 times his current rate, which, written as a number on an official document, looked different than it had sounded in a conversation. The benefits were comprehensive. The flexibility clause was, as he'd requested, specific. Employee's schedule shall accommodate parental obligations for 1 minor dependent, including but not limited to school schedule adjustments, medical appointments, and child care contingencies, without reduction in compensation or standing, subject to operational requirements that shall be negotiated in good faith with employee in advance where feasible. He read that paragraph 4 times. He circled one phrase, negotiated in good faith, and made a note in the margin to ask his mother what she thought, because his mother had 23 years of reading contracts as a paralegal before she retired, and she did not let sentiment interfere with reading the fine print. He went to bed at 11:15, which was late for him, and lay awake for another 20 minutes thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. His mother, Carol Brooks, came over on Saturday. She was 61, the kind of woman who moved through rooms like she'd decided where everything was going to be before she got there, who cooked in Mason's kitchen with the comfortable authority of someone who had taught him to cook in the first place and had opinions about his spice organization. She had strong hands, a measured laugh, and the capacity to hold her expression completely neutral while she absorbed information that was, internally, rearranging her understanding of a situation. She read the contract at the kitchen table while Lily told her, in comprehensive detail, about the helicopter incident and her stopwatch. Carol listened to Lily with the full attention she brought to everything Lily said. She did not do the thing that some adults did, of managing a child's story from a distance, waiting for the part that was addressed to them. She actually listened. Lily noticed this and rewarded it with increasing levels of detail. 2 minutes and 58 seconds, Carol said when Lily finished. I timed it myself, Lily said. I know you did, baby. I heard you the first time. Carol turned a page of the contract. Your father's fast. He knew what it was before they even asked him, Lily said, with the proprietary pride of someone whose person has been publicly vindicated. I know he did. Carol turned another page. She circled something. She made a small sound that Mason, standing at the stove making lunch, recognized as her processing sound. What? He said. Nothing yet. She kept reading. He waited. Lily, having delivered her full account, opened her deep-sea fish book. Carol finished the contract. She set it on the table and smoothed the top page with her palm, in the particular way she had of indicating that she was done reading and ready to speak. The flexibility clause is real, she said. I've seen language like that turn into nothing when management changes. This is specific. This is enforceable. She paused. Whoever wrote it was trying. She told the lawyer to get it right, Mason said. That's different from the lawyer getting it right on their own. She looked at him over her coffee cup. She means it. He turned off the burner. I think so too. You've already decided, she said. It wasn't a question. I signed it Tuesday, he said. I was just letting you read it because I respect your professional opinion. Carol looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Mason Andre Brooks, in the particular register that meant she was both exasperated and entirely unsurprised. You couldn't have told me Tuesday. I wanted you to read it fresh. I am 61 years old, and I read every word of a contract for my son that he has already signed. Mom! She shook her head. Then she picked up her coffee. Does she know what she's getting? He thought about it. She's starting to. The announcement went internal on a Thursday morning, timed to go out at 8 a.m. before most of the staff arrived so that the email was there when they opened their laptops and the day could absorb it rather than stopping for it. Vanessa had written the announcement herself and revised it 4 times, which was 2 more revisions than she normally gave to internal communications. The final version was direct. Mason Brooks, formerly of building maintenance, was joining Sterling Logistics as Director of Aviation Operations, effective the following Monday. His background was described accurately and without embellishment. The announcement acknowledged, briefly and without excessive ceremony, that Mason had been instrumental in resolving a long-standing operational issue with the company's executive aircraft. What it did not say, what Vanessa had considered including and then removed because it crossed the line between transparency and performance, was that she had dismissed him in front of her staff on a rooftop in March before he'd had a chance to say anything, and that she had been wrong. She kept that between herself and the people who had been there. Richard Hale sent a company-wide reply all about looking forward to Mason's contributions to the team, which was the correct professional behavior and cost Richard something to do gracefully. Vanessa noticed this and respected it. The response from the rest of the staff was largely positive, with the particular quality of positive responses in organizations where people are trying to read the temperature before committing to a position. A few people who'd worked in aviation operations or logistics sent more genuine notes. A woman named Patricia from the compliance team sent a 3-line message that said she'd heard about the helicopter and that it was about time someone fixed the thing, which made Vanessa almost smile. From Gerald Kwan, silence, which was, Vanessa thought, probably the most honest response in the building. Monday arrived the way significant Mondays always do, unremarkably, in the sense that the morning contained all the regular elements of morning and didn't rearrange itself to reflect what the day meant. Mason's alarm went off at 5:50. He made coffee. He checked Lily's backpack for her homework folder, which she'd left on the kitchen counter instead of in the backpack, which she did at least twice a week. He made her lunch while she ate breakfast and told him that bioluminescent fish could produce their own light through a chemical reaction involving a compound called luciferin, and that she thought this was kind of beautiful, actually. It is kind of beautiful, he agreed. Can we get a fish? No. What if it glows? Especially not then. He dropped her at school at 7:40. He drove to Hargrove Tower. He parked on level B2, which was where he had parked for 4 years, because the new parking arrangement for director-level staff, which put him on B1, closer to the executive elevator bank, felt strange enough that he decided to ease into it. He walked through the building with his badge, which had been updated overnight by building security and now read Mason Brooks, Director, Aviation Operations. Sterling Logistics in crisp new type that looked slightly unreal, the way your own name looks unreal in certain contexts. He rode the elevator to the 41st floor, where the Aviation Operations Suite occupied a cluster of offices overlooking the river. He'd been up here once, when Richard had given him a brief tour the previous week as part of the transition. The offices were functional, not lavish, but equipped. There was a main operations room with 3 workstations and a large display screen showing the current status of the company's flight operations. There was a conference room used for maintenance reviews. And there was the director's office, which had a window and a desk that was already cleaner than anything Mason had used in 4 years of maintenance work. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Jenny, Vanessa's assistant, who was apparently also functioning as a general resource for the aviation suite until they hired a dedicated coordinator, appeared behind him with a tablet. "Your IT access is set up," she said. "Password reset prompt will come to your new company email. The maintenance database integration is pending. They said by end of day. Your first scheduled review is Thursday, 9 a.m. Fleet maintenance logs for Q1. I can brief you on the format if you want, or I can leave you the documentation." "Leave me the documentation," Mason said. "I'll read it myself." "There's also a message from Ms. Sterling. She said to tell you," Jenny glanced at her tablet. "She said to tell you that the coffee on 41 is terrible, and you should use the executive kitchen on 58 until we get a better machine. She said, and I'm quoting, 'It tastes like something that was once near coffee and then gave up.'" Mason considered this. "Tell her I appreciate the warning." Jenny made a note. She left him alone. He walked into his office. He stood at the window and looked at the river, which was doing its flat gray thing, carrying barges south under a March sky that had decided to be slightly less hostile today. He thought about the roof, 58 floors up, and the helicopter sitting on it, running now, waiting to fly. He sat at his desk. He opened the maintenance database. He started reading. The first week was not, if Mason was being honest with himself, what he'd imagined. Not worse, different. The work was real, and it was substantial, and the state of the aviation operations documentation was, in certain places, genuinely troubling in the way that things are troubling when you understand what the gaps could mean. He found 3 instances in the first 48 hours where maintenance intervals had been recorded as completed when the supporting documentation was incomplete. Not fraudulently, just sloppily, the kind of slop that accumulates when oversight is procedural rather than substantive, when someone is checking a box rather than checking a system. He documented each one carefully and did not immediately send an email to anyone about it. He spent the first week building a picture before he started drawing conclusions. Vanessa stopped by the 41st floor on Wednesday afternoon, which he had not expected and which Jenny had not warned him about, which suggested it was unscheduled. She appeared in the doorway of his office with the slightly incongruous quality of someone in an expensive coat standing at the entrance to a working space that was currently covered in printed maintenance logs. She looked at the logs. "How bad is it?" "It's not bad," he said. "It's the kind of thing that hasn't become bad yet because nothing's failed. But there are gaps that need addressing." He turned one of the logs to face her. "This aircraft completed a 100-hour inspection in January. The documentation shows the fuel system check is complete, but there's no corresponding sign-off from a certified technician. The inspector and the certifier are supposed to be 2 different people." Vanessa looked at the log. Her expression was the one he was starting to recognize as her paying genuine attention rather than managing a situation. "What does that mean practically?" "It means if something failed on that aircraft and we were in front of an FAA investigation, we couldn't prove the inspection was properly completed. Even if it was. Can we fix it retroactively?" "We can't fix the documentation retroactively. That would be worse than the gap. We can do a reinspection and create clean records going forward." He paused. "And we should look at who was signing off on these and why the separation of duties wasn't being enforced. That was Richard's oversight." "I'm not assigning blame," Mason said. "I'm describing what needs to happen." She was quiet for a moment. He noticed that she didn't try to manage it, didn't soften it or reframe it or look for a way to make the news less than what it was. She just absorbed it and moved forward. How long to address the full scope? 90 days to audit and recertify everything that has gaps. 30 days to implement a documentation protocol that prevents it going forward. He looked at the logs. "We should also do a review of our inspection vendor contracts. Some of these firms have been doing our maintenance checks for 3 years with no performance review. That's how you get box checkers instead of inspectors." Vanessa leaned against the door frame. She looked at him in the way she'd looked at him in her office that first afternoon, like she was recalibrating something. "I want weekly updates," she said. "Direct to me, not through Richard. He's transitioning out and I don't want anything filtered right now." "Understood." "And Mason," she said his first name with the slight self-consciousness of someone who is making a deliberate choice about how to address someone and is aware they're making it. "What I said when you first came to the office, about the $2.3 million and 47 engineers." She paused. "I want you to feel like you can tell me things that are that uncomfortable without worrying about the reception." He looked at her. "I'll tell you what I see. What you do with it is your call. That's all I'm asking." She left. He went back to the logs. On Thursday morning, Mason had his first formal team meeting with the 2 aviation operations coordinators who reported to his position. Their names were Diane Cho and Paul Weatherford, and they were, respectively, meticulous and chronically late, Diane to everything, Paul to the meeting itself, arriving 4 minutes after the scheduled start with a coffee cup and an apology that sounded practiced. "I have a thing about mornings," Paul said. "Noted," Mason said. "Starting time for our standing meetings moves to 9:30. Paul blinked. "Oh, okay." Diane looked at Mason with a cautious expression that he read correctly as the look of someone who has been working in a system for long enough to be surprised when the system adjusts itself to practical reality instead of insisting on its own procedures. He ran the meeting with the methodology he'd developed over 12 years of Army briefings. Start with what's known, establish what's unknown, assign clear ownership of everything that needs an owner, and end before the meeting has exhausted its own usefulness. It took 40 minutes. Diane took notes with the focused efficiency of someone who had been wanting to take notes in meetings like this for a while. Paul asked 3 questions that were all good questions that happened to arrive in a slightly disorganized way, which Mason was already calibrating for. After Diane left, Paul lingered in the conference room doorway. "Can I ask you something?" Paul said. "Go ahead." "The helicopter." Paul gestured vaguely upward, meaning the roof. "Is it true you knew what it was the whole time?" Mason considered how to answer this. "I had a strong working theory." "And nobody asked you?" "Nobody asked me." Paul stood with this for a moment. He was 34. Mason had gathered 8 years with the company, competent enough to have survived 3 management changes without getting pushed out, which required a certain adaptability. "I think Richard knew, kind of, that there might be someone in the building with relevant background. He just—" Paul stopped. "I don't know. He had a way of looking for things in the places he expected them to be." "Most people do," Mason said. "Does that bother you? Still?" Mason picked up his folder of maintenance logs. He thought about the honest answer, which was more complicated than a yes or no. "I spent 11 months watching a problem I could solve. That's a specific kind of frustration." He paused. "But I also wasn't doing anything to change the situation. I was waiting to be asked. That's on me too." Paul seemed to sit with that. "That's a pretty fair way to look at it." "It's just accurate," Mason said. He went back to his office. Done. The helicopter flew for the first time on the 3rd Thursday of Mason's new role. He hadn't scheduled it. It wasn't on his calendar or Vanessa's calendar. What had happened was that the aircraft had been cleared for flight operations following a full post-downtime inspection that Mason had personally supervised over the previous 2 weeks. Going through every system with the thoroughness of someone who understood that exceptional condition in a diagnostic report and safe for flight operations were related but distinct determinations. He'd signed the return to service documentation on Wednesday afternoon. He'd sent Vanessa a 1-line email. Aircraft cleared for operations effective immediately. She'd replied 4 minutes later. Thursday morning? He'd replied, weather permitting. Thursday morning had arrived with low clouds and a wind that was brisk but manageable, the temperature above freezing for the first time in what felt like weeks. At 7:15, Mason took the elevator to the rooftop. He did his pre-flight walk around the way he always did. Not as ceremony, but as practice, because you did your pre-flight the same way every time so that the time it actually mattered, you'd already built the habit. Vanessa arrived at 7:40 in her pilot's gear, which looked different on her than the executive coat he'd come to associate with her. More functional. More like someone who knew what she was doing and was dressed for that thing specifically. She looked at the aircraft, then at him. Everything good? Everything's good. She ran her pre-flight. He watched her do it, not to check her, but because watching someone do something correctly and with genuine competence was one of the things Mason found quietly satisfying, regardless of what the thing was. She moved through the checklist the way a person who has done something enough times moves through it. Present, but not performative, focused without being stiff. She climbed in. The engine started on the first attempt. Both turbines. Clean, immediate, no hesitation. Mason stood on the helipad and watched the rotor blades accelerate from their locked position through the full rotation speed, the characteristic sound of the Sikorsky rising from its startup pitch into its operating tone, the landing gear lights cycling through to green. She lifted off. Not dramatically, cleanly, the aircraft rising straight and level from the pad with the uncomplicated purposefulness of a machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. It climbed to about 200 feet above the building, held there for a moment, and then banked left over the river. Mason stood on the roof and watched it. He was thinking, with a directness that surprised him, about Elena. He did not do this often in the middle of the day, but there was something about the aircraft lifting off the roof, The roof he'd walked across every Tuesday and Thursday for 4 years. The machine he'd known how to fix from the first day he'd seen it grounded. That moved something in him that he hadn't expected to be moved. She would have laughed. That was always the first thought, and it always helped. She would have laughed at all of it. The 11 months, the 47 engineers, the 7-year-old with the stopwatch. And then she would have found his hand, which was how she processed things that were both funny and significant. He stood there until the helicopter had made its initial circuit and was coming back in. Then he put his hands in his jacket pockets and watched Vanessa Sterling bring the aircraft down onto the pad with the practiced ease of a pilot who has been waiting 11 months to do exactly this. The engines wound down. She cut power. She climbed out and stood on the helipad. She looked at Mason, and whatever she'd been holding in her expression all morning, the particular quality of someone who has been managing their anticipation carefully, released slightly. "It flew," she said. It was a strange thing to say, given the obvious evidence, but he understood what she meant. "It flew," he agreed. She looked at the aircraft for a moment. Then she said, without looking at him, in a different register than anything she'd said before, quieter, directed inward, "I wasted 11 months. "No," Mason said. She looked at him. "You spent 11 months looking for the answer in the places that made sense to look," he said. "That's not the same thing." He paused. "The waste was in not expanding where you were looking, but that's fixable. That's what you hired me to help fix." She held his gaze for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how much to accept something. "You're going to tell me things I don't want to hear," she said. It wasn't a complaint. "Probably on a fairly regular basis," he said. "Good," she said, and she meant it, and he could hear that she meant it. The wind moved over the rooftop and the helicopter sat in its proper silence, the silence of something that worked. And below them the city went about the enormous indifferent work of being itself. Mason thought about Lily's fish book, about things that make their own light from the inside, through chemistry and evolution and the patient work of being exactly what they are in the dark. He thought she'd probably find that relevant if he told her. He'd tell her tonight. She'd have opinions about it. He was already looking forward to hearing them. The 90-day audit was not a popular project. Mason had expected this. Organizations that have been running a certain way for a certain amount of time develop a specific resistance to being examined closely, not usually out of bad faith, but out of the particular discomfort of people who have been doing their jobs adequately and do not love the process of having adequacy documented in writing. The aviation operations team was small enough that there was nowhere to diffuse that discomfort. It landed directly on Diane, on Paul, on the 3 external maintenance contractors whose agreements Mason had flagged in his first week, and on a rotating cast of people from compliance, legal, and finance who found themselves in the 41st floor conference room being asked questions they hadn't prepared for. Mason ran these sessions the same way he ran everything, methodically, without drama, with the complete attention of someone who understood that the details were where the actual information lived. He did not make people feel accused. He made people feel examined, which was different and which some people still found uncomfortable, but which was at least accurate to what was happening. The first contractor review in week 3 was with a firm called Apex Aviation Services, which had been handling the company's routine maintenance checks on 2 of its 3 charter aircraft for the past 3 years. They sent their operations manager, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s named Dennis Farrell, who arrived in a company polo shirt with the energy of someone who had come to a meeting they expected to be formality and had not yet realized it wasn't. Dennis shook Mason's hand with the automatic confidence of someone who had done a lot of vendor meetings and knew the rhythm of them. "Good to meet you. We've had a strong relationship with Sterling for 3 years. Really no issues, solid service record. I think you'll find everything in order." "I'm sure I will," Mason said. He opened the folder on the table. "I want to start with the inspection documentation for the Cessna citation, tail number N7841, specifically the avionics check from last September." Dennis's confidence adjusted slightly, the way a ship adjusts when the current changes. "September, sure, that would have been..." Carla was lead on that, I believe. "The documentation shows the avionics check as completed. The sign-off is from your technician, Mark Aldridge." Mason turned a page. Mark Aldridge's certification lapsed in July, 2 months before the inspection. The room was quiet. Dennis looked at the page. He looked at it with the specific quality of a person who is simultaneously reading something and buying time for his brain to catch up with what his eyes are telling him. He cleared his throat. That's something I'd need to verify. I verified it, Mason said. His recertification was completed in December. The September inspection was performed and signed off during the 2-month gap. He set the page down. I'm not suggesting the work wasn't done correctly. I'm saying the certification to perform and document that work wasn't valid at the time. Paul Weatherford, sitting to Mason's left, was very still in the way of someone who has realized they are watching something significant and is trying not to affect its course. What does this mean for the contract? Dennis asked. His voice had lost its initial quality entirely. He was somewhere between defensive and genuinely concerned, and Mason thought the concern was probably real. This was not a man who had known about this and chosen to ignore it. This was a man discovering a problem he was going to have to go home and explain to someone. It means the September inspection needs to be reperformed and documented by a currently certified technician, Mason said. And it means your quality control process has a gap that allowed an expired certification to sign off on work. I'd like a written explanation of how that happened and what you're doing to prevent it. And the contract? Mason looked at him. He'd thought about this answer. The contract renewal is in April. Between now and then, I want a full certification audit of every technician you have touching our aircraft. Clean audit, the contract renews. Problems we can't resolve, we go a different direction. He paused. I'd rather fix the relationship than replace it. You've been doing solid work. The September issue is a process failure, not a pattern, but it has to be addressed. Dennis nodded. He was doing the recalibration that people do when they've been met with something they expected to be hostile and turned out to be direct but fair. I'll have the audit to you within 10 days. 2 weeks is fine, Mason said. Do it right. After Dennis left, Paul leaned back in his chair and let out a breath. How'd you know about the certification? I cross-referenced the technician sign-offs against the FAA certification database, Mason said. It took about 4 hours. Richard never did that. Richard wasn't wrong not to, Mason said. It's not a standard practice for vendor oversight at this level. It should probably be standard practice for us going forward, but that's a different conversation. He stacked the folders. It's also possible Apex has been doing perfectly good work for 3 years, and this is an isolated administrative failure. We don't know yet. That's why we're looking. Paul was quiet for a moment, then, Can I ask you something else? You ask a lot of things. It's how I learn things. Mason almost smiled at that. Go ahead. When you were in maintenance, building maintenance, did you ever think about doing this? Director level, aviation operations? Mason thought about the honest answer. Not this specifically. I thought about doing something that used what I actually know. This turned out to be that thing. He picked up the folder. Why? Paul shrugged, but it wasn't a casual shrug. It had the self-consciousness of something he'd been thinking about. I've been here 8 years. I'm good at this job. He stopped. I don't know how to make the next thing happen without it happening to me. The way this happened to you. Mason looked at him for a moment. Paul Weatherford, he had decided in 3 weeks, was more capable than his perpetual mild disorganization suggested. He was someone who understood systems and who thought carefully before he spoke, which was worth more in operations work than tidiness. The next thing doesn't usually happen to you, Mason said. You have to build the case for it. Document what you know. Make sure the people above you can see it. He paused. You want me to see it too. Say so directly. Not in a meeting like this, in a conversation where that's what the conversation is about. Paul held his gaze. Is that what you're saying we should have? I'm saying when you're ready for it, ask for it. Paul nodded. He wrote something in his notebook. Mason noticed he'd started bringing a notebook to every meeting in the 3rd week, which Mason had not requested, and which he'd taken as a good sign. The documentation issue with Apex Aviation was resolved cleanly within the timeline Mason had given them. Dennis Farrell delivered a certification audit that was thorough enough to suggest he'd taken it seriously, along with a written process correction that Mason reviewed, annotated, and returned with 2 questions and no major objections. The contract renewed in April. What Mason had not anticipated was that the process of looking carefully at one thing had a way of training people around him to look more carefully at other things. Diane Cho brought him a discrepancy she'd found in the fuel expense reconciliation for the third charter aircraft. Not a significant amount, $43, but the category it was logged under didn't match the vendor it came from. She flagged it on a Tuesday morning with the careful quality of someone who wasn't sure if she was reporting something important or wasting her director's time. "It's probably just a data entry error," she said. "Show me," Mason said. It was not a data entry error. It was, as it turned out, a minor but consistent pattern of fuel charges being logged under a maintenance category rather than an operations category, which had been going on for 14 months and which had the effect of obscuring the actual per-flight operating cost of the aircraft from the financial summaries that went to Vanessa's desk. Not fraudulently. The money was real, the fuel was real, the category was just wrong. But wrong in a way that had consistently made one aircraft look cheaper to operate than it actually was. Mason brought it to Vanessa directly, the way she'd asked him to bring things. She looked at the spreadsheet he'd laid out for her. He watched her read it. Not skim it, read it. She had that quality, which he'd come to appreciate, of actually processing information she was given rather than receiving it and moving on. 14 months, she said. At least, I haven't gone back further yet. What's the real per-flight cost? He told her. She was quiet for a moment with the arithmetic. That aircraft should have been flagged for cost review 8 months ago, she said. Based on accurate numbers, yes. She put the spreadsheet down. Is this malicious? I don't think so. It looks like a category setup error that nobody caught because nobody was looking at the 2 systems simultaneously. He paused. But it had a real effect on decisions that were made with inaccurate data. Vanessa was quiet. He could see her doing what she did when information was landing at the deeper level. Not just filing it, but letting it change something. How many other places in our operations reporting is data going to the wrong bucket? I don't know yet, he said, but that's probably the right question. She looked at him. How long to find out? If I have access to the full reporting structure, 60 days. You have it, she said. Full access, whatever you need from finance. I'll send a note to the CFO today. She made the note while he was still in the room, which he'd learned was how she handled things she meant to do immediately. She did them immediately, rather than scheduling them, because she'd found that the gap between intending to do something and doing it was where things went wrong. He was on his way to the elevator when she said his name. He turned. The thing you said last month, she said. On the roof, after the flight. She was looking at the spreadsheet. About the waste. 11 months. She set the page down. I've been thinking about it. Okay. I want to be clear about something. She looked up. I appreciate what you said, but I also don't want to let myself off too easy. There's a version of accepting your framing where I just decide I was doing my best and the system failed me. And that's not fully true. She paused. I hired Richard Hale because he had the right credentials, and I didn't ask hard enough questions about whether he had the right instincts. That's a hiring decision I made. The 47 engineers, I kept approving that spend because I trusted the credential over the result. That's a pattern in how I think. She was being precise about this, not self-flagellating, just accurate. I want to know when I'm doing that again. Mason held this for a moment. You want me to tell you when you're mistaking credentials for competence? Yes. I can do that, he said. It'll be uncomfortable sometimes. I know. And you have to actually want to hear it in the moment, he said, not just in principle. She met his gaze. That's fair. He nodded. He went back to the elevator. He pressed the button for 41. He stood in the elevator and thought that this was either the beginning of a working relationship that was going to be genuinely useful to both of them, or it was the kind of thing people said in good faith and couldn't maintain when the actual uncomfortable moment arrived. He'd find out. Lily turned 8 in April, 3 weeks into Mason's second month in his new role. She had requested, with the specificity that characterized most of her requests, a birthday that involved the following: the deep-sea aquarium exhibit at the Shed Aquarium, lunch somewhere that had good grilled cheese, not the kind where they do something fancy to it, just regular good grilled cheese, and her grandmother coming over for cake in the evening. She had not requested a party, which she had explained was because parties required managing other people's enjoyment, which she found kind of exhausting, honestly. Mason had taken the day off. This was the first time since starting the new role that he had taken a full day off, and he had done it by sending Vanessa a calendar block 3 weeks in advance that said simply, Lily's birthday, out of office, and receiving back, 6 minutes later, a single word, obvious. He'd almost smiled at that. The aquarium was everything Lily had required it to be. She stood in front of the bioluminescent jellyfish display for 11 minutes. He timed it because she'd timed something for him, and it seemed right, with the particular stillness she had when something was exceeding her expectations. She narrated facts at him about each exhibit not as performance, but as sharing, the way she always shared things that interested her, with the implicit confidence that if something was interesting to her, it was probably interesting to him too, and the trust that he would tell her if it wasn't. He was always interested. He was aware that this was partly because she was his daughter, and partly because she was genuinely interesting, and he tried to be honest about which was which. They found a diner near the aquarium that had what Lily deemed acceptable grilled cheese after a brief but intense evaluation of the menu. She ate methodically. He drank coffee. She told him about a project she was doing at school about ocean habitats and asked him whether he thought bioluminescence was a form of communication or just a function of survival. Probably both, he said. Most things are. She considered this. Like the helicopter? He looked at her. What do you mean? It was broken, and now it's fixed. That's survival. But also you fixed it, and now you have a different job. She bit into her sandwich. That's communication. The helicopter communicated that you should have a different job. He looked at his coffee. He thought about the specific logic of a newly 8-year-old who had absorbed 12 years of her father's mechanical thinking and was now applying it to narrative. That's an interesting way to look at it, he said. I know, she said, not immodestly, matter-of-factly. He thought about Elena again, the way he always thought about her on Lily's birthday, not with the specific grief of the early years, but with the complicated tenderness of time. She would have loved this conversation. She would have written it down. Elena had carried a small notebook and wrote down the things Lily said, from the first day Lily said things worth writing down. And Mason had the notebook in the drawer of his nightstand where he kept things that mattered. He hadn't added to it. It wasn't his notebook, not exactly, but he'd read it sometimes, and the things in it made Lily's voice in the present more dimensional somehow, layered over this earlier version of itself. Dad, Lily said. Yeah. You're doing the face. He looked at her. What face? The thinking about mom face. She said it with the directness she brought to things that other people handled carefully. She'd always been this way. She hadn't learned to treat the subject with the fragility that adults sometimes brought to it. She just talked about her mother the way she talked about anything she knew. I was, he said. What were you thinking? That she would have written down what you said about the helicopter. Lily was quiet for a moment, then, the notebook thing? Yeah. She nodded. She ate the last triangle of her sandwich. I remember the notebook. He wasn't sure she did. She'd been 2 when Elena died, and memory at 2 was mostly sensation, mostly body. But he didn't correct her, because maybe she meant she remembered it in a different way. The way you remember something that was explained to you early enough that the explanation becomes part of your understanding of the world. She would have thought the bioluminescence thing was cool, Lily said. She would have, he agreed. Lily picked up her water glass. I think she'd be happy about the helicopter job. Mason looked at his daughter, 8 years old today. She had Elena's eyes, that specific hazel that shifted color with the light, and his stubbornness and a mind that was entirely her own. I think so too, he said. The service bulletin was Mason's idea, and he almost didn't do it. He'd been thinking about it since the first week, since the moment on the roof when he'd walked Vanessa through the specifics of the vapor lock condition and watched understanding cross her face. He'd been thinking about the 2019 bulletin and the operators who probably had the same aircraft with the same fuel management controller and the same rare set of conditions that could produce the same failure. He'd been thinking about whether those operators' maintenance teams had caught it, or whether somewhere, in a city he didn't know, there was an S-76D that had been grounded for 6 months, while a procession of aviation firms produced clean diagnostic reports. Or worse. He'd been thinking about worse. He brought it to Vanessa on a Thursday in late April, on a morning where she had back-to-back meetings starting at 9, and he caught her at 8:20 with a cup of coffee she was actually going to drink. "I want to send a technical advisory," he said. She looked at him over the cup. "To who?" "Every operator we can identify running an S-76D with the Series C fuel management controller. The specific configuration that produces this failure." He set a one-page summary on her desk. "There are probably 40, 50 operators in North America. Some will have already caught it, some won't." She read the summary. He watched her read it. "We'd be telling our competitors we had an 11-month grounded aircraft." "Yes." "That's not exactly a flattering disclosure." "No," he agreed. "It's also not the point." She looked up from the page. "If someone else has this condition and hasn't identified it," Mason said, "and they try to fly the aircraft in the wrong circumstances, wrong temperature window, specific startup sequence, fuel saturation at the wrong level, the failure mode isn't just grounding. Under the wrong conditions, it could be catastrophic." He said this flatly, without emphasis, because it didn't need emphasis. "I'm not comfortable knowing that and not saying something." Vanessa was quiet. "It would come with legal exposure," she said. "Acknowledging the condition publicly means acknowledging we had it." "I know." "I'll need to loop in counsel." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking you to do it without thinking about it. I'm telling you what I think should happen and why." She looked at the summary again. She set down her coffee. This was, he had learned, what she did when she was making a real decision rather than a managed one. She put down whatever she was holding and gave the thing her full, unencumbered attention. "Draft the advisory," she said. "I want to see the exact language. I'll talk to counsel today." She paused. "And Mason, this is the right thing to do. I want to say that clearly, not just process it as a risk decision." "I know it is," he said. "That's why I'm here." The legal conversation was not simple. Vanessa's general counsel, a careful, silver-haired woman named Margaret Holt, who had been with the company for 6 years and who had seen Vanessa make decisions she thought were inadvisable and had learned to voice her concerns exactly once and then execute the decision anyway, had a long list of concerns about the advisory. She laid them out in a conference room meeting that included Vanessa, Mason, and the company's outside aviation counsel, a younger man named Thomas Reeve, who specialized in FAA compliance and who arrived with a tablet full of case references. Margaret went first. "The advisory, as drafted, effectively constitutes an acknowledgement that we were aware of a potential safety defect in a commercial aviation context and failed to report it through FAA channels." "We weren't aware of a defect," Mason said. "We had an undiagnosed mechanical condition that was consistently returning clean in all inspection protocols. The moment we identified the condition and the mechanism, I corrected it and documented the correction. The distinction may not survive a liability argument." "I understand that." He looked at her. "The advisory isn't a liability decision. The failure to send it would be." Thomas Reeve looked up from his tablet. "There's actually a framework for this under voluntary disclosure provisions. If we go through ASAP," he referenced the FAA's Aviation Safety Action Program, "voluntary disclosure with full documentation of our corrective action, the liability exposure is significantly reduced compared to disclosure after an incident." "An incident," Margaret said carefully. "That may never occur." "Or may occur in the next 6 months with a different operator," Mason said. "I'm not willing to calculate that probability as a business decision." The room was quiet. Vanessa had been sitting at the end of the table without speaking, which was what she did when she was letting people lay out the full landscape before she said anything. Now she said, "What does the advisory look like if we frame it as a voluntary technical communication under ASAP with full FAA notification?" Thomas was already typing. "I can have that language drafted by end of business. It changes the framing from disclosure of a defect to voluntary safety communication, which is different legally and different in terms of industry reception." Do it, Vanessa said. Margaret, I hear your concerns. Document them formally so they're on record. But we're moving forward. She looked at Mason. How do we get it to the right operators? The S-76D Operators Network, he said. There's an informal consortium, flight departments primarily, that circulates technical communications. I have contacts from my Army days who are connected to that network. They can push it through faster than a formal channel. Use them. He nodded. Margaret gathered her papers with the expression of a person who has said their piece and is professionally prepared to move on. I'll have the formal objection documented by noon. Thank you, Margaret, Vanessa said, and she meant it. The kind of thank you that acknowledges that a person did their job correctly even when the outcome went the other direction. The advisory went out on a Friday, formatted as a voluntary technical safety communication, routed through the FAA's ASAP program, and distributed through the S-76D Operators Network simultaneously. Mason had worked on the language with Thomas Reeve for 3 days, making sure it was precise enough to be useful and clear enough to be acted on, describing the specific configuration, the specific conditions, the specific correction, the specific service bulletin that documented it. He sent it on a Friday morning and then went back to his regular work, because that was what you did. You did the thing that needed doing, and then you went back to work. He was reviewing Q2 maintenance projections at his desk at 2 p.m. when Diane knocked on his open door. Email, she said. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard from her before. You're going to want to read it. He looked at her, then at his screen. The email was from a flight operations manager at a company called Meridian Air Charter, based in Denver. Her name was Suzanne Park, and she had 9 sentences and the brevity of someone writing in the middle of a significant event. Mr. Brooks, received your advisory this morning. We have an S-76D Series C controller that has been grounded for 4 months. 7 diagnostic reports. Clean every time. Your advisory description matches our situation exactly. Our technician ran your correction sequence an hour ago. Aircraft is running. I don't have adequate words for this. Thank you. Mason read it twice. He thought about the 7 diagnostic reports. 4 months. Some flight department somewhere in Denver with the same problem, the same accumulation of clean reports that said nothing was wrong, the same quiet of a grounded aircraft. Fixed now. Diane was watching him from the doorway. That's one, she said. He looked at her. 1 operator, she said. How many did we send it to? 47, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved in her expression. Not sentimentality. She wasn't the sentimental type, but something real. You want coffee? The machine on 41 is still terrible, but I found a workaround involving the filter size. Yeah, he said. Thanks. She went to get it. He looked at Suzanne Park's email again. He thought about the S-76D in Denver running for the first time in 4 months. The sound of those turbines catching, the instrument panel cycling from amber to green. He thought about the people who flew in that aircraft, and the people who depended on whoever flew in it, and the chain of ordinary life that connected all of them to a technical communication sent from the 41st floor of a building in Chicago. He forwarded the email to Vanessa with no subject line and no additional text. She replied in 4 minutes. 2 words. Well done. He closed his email. He went back to the maintenance projections. By the end of the following week, 3 more operators had responded with variations of Suzanne Park's message. One of them, a corporate flight department in Atlanta, added a detail that Mason read carefully and then sat with for a long time. Their aircraft had been scheduled for a charter flight the week before the advisory arrived, carrying 11 passengers. A pre-flight check had flagged an anomaly, and the flight had been delayed. The correction Mason's advisory described had been applied. The aircraft had then run perfectly. He didn't know what would have happened on that charter flight. He couldn't know. The failure mode under the worst conditions was documented in the service bulletin, but the worst conditions were also specific and rare, and maybe nothing would have happened. But he didn't know that either. He saved the email. He didn't forward it to Vanessa. Some things you process privately, not because they're secret, but because they belong to a different register than professional communication. This one was between him and the 11 people who didn't know there had been anything to worry about. Carol Brooks came to the 41st floor on a Wednesday afternoon in early May because she'd been in the building for an appointment with her doctor's office 2 floors up, and Mason had texted her to stop by if she had time. She walked into his office and stood in the doorway looking at it the way she'd looked at his contract, evaluatively, taking in what the evidence said. "Nice window," she said. "The river does something different every time," he said. "I've been watching it." She came in and sat across from his desk and looked at him with the full attention she'd always given him, from his first day of school, through 12 years of Army service, through the worst year of his life, and out the other side. "You look different," she said. "Different how?" She thought about it. Less careful. He considered this. He'd been carrying a specific kind of careful for 4 years. The careful of a person who had learned to manage expectations in every direction, to exist within the space he was given, to be good at things without drawing attention to being good at them. He wasn't sure he'd known he was carrying it until she named it. "The work fits," he said. "I can see that." She looked at the maintenance log stacked on his desk. "How is she? The Sterling woman?" "Vanessa." He thought about how to characterize it accurately. "She's someone who can be wrong and then actually change. That's rarer than people think." Carol nodded slowly. "And she knows what she has in you." "She's starting to." "Make sure she keeps knowing," Carol said, with the precision of someone who had watched people's understanding of things fade over time when it wasn't maintained. He looked at her. "You think I'll let her forget?" "I think you have a habit," she said, not unkindly, "of letting people not see you. It's worked okay so far." She looked out the window at the river. "But you're doing bigger things now. You don't get to be invisible anymore. That means you have to let people see what you're actually doing." He held this. It was the same thing he'd told Paul Weatherford about building the case for yourself. He hadn't quite applied it to himself in the same terms. "Lily said something," he said. "She said the helicopter communicated that I should have a different job." Carol looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. The full laugh, the one she used when something was exactly right, in a way that also made her a little sad about how long it took to arrive. "That girl," she said. "That girl has been paying attention." "She has," Mason said. "To everything," Carol said, "including you." He looked out at the river. It was doing something different today. The light was hitting it from a lower angle, making it look briefly like something other than the flat gray he'd been watching all month, more like water than concrete, more like itself. "I know," he said. "I know she has." The summer came to Chicago the way it always did, without asking permission, converting the city overnight from something you endured into something that made you understand why people stayed. The lake turned blue instead of gray. The streets filled up with the particular energy of a place that has been cold for too long and is now making up for it with aggressive enthusiasm. Mason noticed it from the 41st floor window every morning, the way the light changed over the river as June deepened into July. He'd been watching that river for 4 months now, long enough to have developed opinions about it. The way it moved differently on windy days, the way the barge traffic slowed on weekday afternoons, the way the light hit it at 7:15 in the morning with a quality that was almost worth being early for. Lily had decided the river was boring compared to the lake, and had told him so during one of her Thursday visits, standing at his window with the evaluative expression she brought to assessments of natural phenomena. He told her the river was doing its job and didn't require her approval. She'd said that was a very dad thing to say, and had gone back to her deep-sea fish book, which had been replaced by a deep-sea fish book that was more advanced than the first one, because she'd exhausted the first one's information density and moved on. The 90-day audit closed on a Tuesday in June. Mason presented the findings to Vanessa and her CFO, a careful man named Howard Finch, who had the particular quality of finance professionals who have learned to absorb bad news without their faces doing anything about it. The presentation took 40 minutes. The findings were not catastrophic. They were the findings of a system that had been running adequately without being examined rigorously, which produced gaps that were correctable rather than fundamental. 14 documentation inconsistencies across 3 aircraft, 2 vendor contracts restructured, 1 reporting category realigned, the per-flight cost data for the entire fleet corrected and rebaselined. Howard Finch asked 4 questions during the presentation, all precise, all relevant. When Mason finished, he made a note on his legal pad and said, "This is the most complete aviation operations picture we've had since I've been CFO." He did not say it warmly. He said it as a factual observation, which Mason found more useful. Vanessa said less during the presentation than Mason expected. She asked two questions, both about implementation timelines rather than the findings themselves, which told him she'd already processed the findings and was past them. After Howard left, she stayed in the conference room. "What's left?" she said. "The vendor performance review system," Mason said. "We need a formal process for evaluating our maintenance contractors on a cycle instead of waiting for a problem. I have a draft framework." "How long to implement?" 60 days to build, ongoing after that." He paused. "And I want to look at the hiring process for aviation staff, not overhaul it, just add a practical skills component. Right now we're hiring on credentials and resumes. I want to see people actually work through a problem." Vanessa looked at the table, then at him. There was something in her expression that he'd started recognizing over the past 4 months. The look of someone cross-referencing what they're hearing against what they've learned. "You mean the way we should have looked at you?" "I mean the way you should look at anyone in a technical role," he said. "It's not about me." "No," she said, "but it started there." He didn't argue with that. She gathered her folder. "Draft the vendor framework. Bring me the hiring process proposal when it's ready." She stood. "And Mason, the audit. I want you to know that what you found and the way you documented it and the fact that you brought every uncomfortable piece of it directly to me instead of managing it, that matters. Not as a compliment, as a statement of what I need this position to be." He looked at her. "I know. I want to make sure you know I know," she said. It was, he thought, a precise thing to say. She'd gotten better at that over 4 months, at saying the thing she meant without dressing it up or leaving it implicit. He wasn't sure if that was always who she was or if something had shifted. Probably both. She left. He went back to his office and opened the vendor framework draft he'd been building for 2 weeks and spent the rest of the afternoon making it something he could actually defend in a room. Paul Weatherford asked for the conversation in late June. He sent a calendar invite with the subject line career discussion. "If you have time," and the 5-word body. "You said to say so directly." Mason had accepted it without comment and blocked an hour on a Friday afternoon, because Friday afternoons were when the operational urgency of the week had usually settled enough to have a conversation that required actual attention. Paul arrived at Mason's office at 3:15 on time, which Mason noticed, and sat across the desk with his notebook and the careful composure of someone who has prepared for something and is managing their own nervousness about having prepared. "I've been here 8 years, Paul said. "I know. I know the fleet inside out. I know the vendor relationships, the FAA compliance calendar, the charter scheduling system. I built parts of it." He paused. "I've been a coordinator for 5 years. I'm not sure I know how to ask for the next thing." "You just did," Mason said. Paul looked at him. "That easy?" "That's the hard part," Mason said. "Everything else is evidence, which you have." He turned his computer monitor slightly toward Paul. "I've been documenting your work for 2 months. Not as surveillance, as the file I'm going to use when I make the case to Vanessa that this department needs a deputy director position, and you're the person for it." Paul was quiet for a moment. "You've already been building that case." "You told me you didn't know how to make the next thing happen without it happening to you," Mason said. "I told you to ask me directly. You did. But I wasn't waiting for you to ask." "Why not?" Mason thought about the honest answer. He thought about 11 months of knowing something no one had asked him about. He thought about Terrence Williams in the parking garage, doing the work without the title. He thought about what his mother had said, "You let people not see you." And the years he'd spent in the exact position Paul was in now, good at the work and invisible to the process that would have recognized it. "Because it's not a good system," he said, "waiting for people to advocate for themselves when the people above them already know." He looked at Paul. "You should advocate for yourself. You're better at it than you think. But I'm not going to sit on what I can already see." Paul sat with this for a moment. Something settled in his expression, not relief exactly, more like something that had been held in a specific kind of tension releasing. "When?" he asked. The deputy director proposal goes to Vanessa next week. Assuming she approves the position, which I think she will, we go to HR for the formal process. Probably 60 days total. He paused. It's not a guarantee. I know. But I'll tell you when it is one, Mason said. I won't make you wait for news I have. Paul nodded. He wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked up. Can I ask you something that's not about the job? Probably. The service bulletin, the operators who wrote back. He paused. Does that... you fixed the helicopter in 3 minutes after 11 months. You sent the advisory and fixed someone else's helicopter in Denver the same day. Does that ever feel like... He searched for the word. Like too much? Like it should feel bigger than it does? Mason looked at the river. It was a Friday afternoon in late June, and the light was doing the thing it did in the early evening, making the water look briefly like it had depth. It feels like doing the job, he said. The job is bigger than it was, but it still just feels like doing it. He paused. The thing that feels big is my daughter timing it on a cracked yellow stopwatch. Paul looked at him for a moment, then quietly, Yeah. Okay. He closed his notebook, and they were done. But the helicopter flew again on a Saturday in July. This time it wasn't Vanessa flying it alone. This time Mason was in the co-pilot seat because Vanessa had asked him 3 weeks earlier, in the particular offhand way she asked things she actually cared about, whether he maintained his flight credentials. He told her he had a private pilot certificate for rotary wing that he'd kept current out of habit and stubbornness, even through 4 years of building maintenance, because letting it lapse had felt like a concession he wasn't willing to make. She'd said, Good, Saturday. He hadn't asked what Saturday meant. He'd known what it meant. The morning was clear and warm, the lake visible from the rooftop as a thin blue line at the eastern edge of the city, the sky above it a shade that Chicago managed maybe 8 times a year and otherwise only in memory. Vanessa did the pre-flight. Mason checked her work, not to find errors because she was thorough, but because 2 sets of eyes was procedure, and he wasn't going to stop following procedure because the circumstances were casual. Lily was on the rooftop. This had been Mason's only condition, stated directly when Vanessa had suggested the flight. Lily came. Not on the flight, she was 8, and this was not the moment for an 8-year-old's first helicopter flight to be an executive aircraft over Chicago. There would be a better moment for that done properly. But on the roof. She'd been there for the fix. It seemed right that she be there for this. Lily stood at the edge of the helipad area, within the safety line, wearing her visitor badge. She'd retired Gerald the name months ago after Gerald Kwan had, in a moment of genuine grace, stopped by the 41st floor to tell Mason that he'd approved Terrence Williams' advancement and that the maintenance team was running well. Gerald had shaken Mason's hand in the hallway and said, gruffly, that the building had apparently known what it was doing keeping him around, which was as close to a compliment as Gerald got, and which Mason had accepted in the spirit it was offered. Lily had been with Mason that day and had revised her assessment of Gerald's name badge upward. She now wore it as a mark of respect. She was holding her stopwatch, though no one had asked her to time anything. Vanessa climbed in. Mason climbed in. They ran through the startup sequence together, the easy shorthand of people who both know the procedure and don't need to narrate it. Both turbines caught clean. The rotors accelerated. The instrument panel lit green. Vanessa looked at him. He nodded once. She lifted the aircraft off the pad. They went up, 200 feet, then 400, then banking west over the river and north along its bend, the city falling away below them into its grid of streets and buildings, and the particular aerial logic that cities have, the way everything that seems complicated from inside it becomes a pattern from above. Mason watched Chicago from the co-pilot seat and thought about the years he'd spent at street level in it, in the parking garage and the maintenance corridors and the stairwells and the gray uniform, and how it looked the same and completely different from here. Not better, not worse, different, in the way that seeing something from a different position doesn't change what it is, but changes what you understand about it. Vanessa flew without commentary, which he appreciated. She had the quality in an aircraft of someone who was doing something she genuinely loved and had no need to perform that love for an audience. She just flew. Clean inputs, confident corrections, the relaxed attention of competence. They made a broad circuit over the north side and came back south, the lake appearing off the right side as they banked, that blue-gray sheet of it extending east until it became indistinguishable from the horizon. Mason looked at it and thought about depth, about things that exist below visible surfaces, about the bioluminescent fish in Lily's book Making Light in the Dark, about the vapor in a fuel line that 11 aerospace firms had walked past without seeing, about the kind of knowing that doesn't announce itself, that just exists, patient and specific, waiting for the question. They came back to the pad with the unhurried precision of a landing that doesn't need to prove anything. The skids touched, the engines wound down, the rotors slowed through their deceleration sequence and stopped. For a moment they sat in the quiet of a shut-down aircraft, the city noise filtering back in around them. "Thank you," Vanessa said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the instrument panel with the expression of someone who has had something returned to them that they'd stopped expecting to get back. "You flew it," he said. "I know." She paused. "I mean for all of it." He looked at the helipad. Lily was still there, standing at the safety line, stopwatch in hand, watching them with the small, serious face she brought to things that mattered. "She timed the landing," he said. Vanessa looked. For the first time in the months he'd known her, something crossed her face that was entirely unmanaged. Just the genuine thing, unguarded for a second. She climbed out of the aircraft and walked to where Lily was standing. "How'd we do?" Vanessa asked. Lily examined the stopwatch display with professional gravity. The landing was 11 seconds from threshold to full stop. She looked up. "Is that good?" "Depends who you're comparing to," Vanessa said. "I'm comparing to my dad," Lily said. "He does everything faster." Vanessa looked at Mason, who was coming around the nose of the aircraft. Something passed between them. Not quite amusement, not quite the formal acknowledgement of two professionals. Something in the middle territory that had been building over 4 months of working alongside each other and had not yet been named. "He does," Vanessa said. "But 11 seconds was good." Lily accepted this with the nod of someone receiving a fair assessment. Vichemum. Mason's mother had a phrase she'd used since he was small, one of those compressed observations that adults deploy so often they stop hearing it until one day the specific weight of it lands. The work shows, not the credential, not the title, not the introduction at the beginning of the meeting. The work itself, over time, visible to anyone paying attention. He'd heard her say it about a neighbor who fixed cars in his driveway, about a teacher at Mason's middle school who'd stayed late 3 days a week for every student who needed it, about his father who'd worked 3 decades laying pipe in conditions that didn't ask him what he thought about them. She'd said it about people no one wrote articles about, people whose specific gravity you only understood if you were close enough to see the work. He thought about it now, 6 months into a job that still surprised him sometimes, when he walked past the building directory and saw his name under aviation operations, in the new context of a Tuesday morning in August when Diane had flagged 3 new responses to the service bulletin and Paul was finishing the deputy director proposal and the vendor performance framework had been approved by Vanessa 2 weeks ago and was now being implemented by the 2 contractors who were paying attention and reviewed by the one who wasn't. 6 operators had now responded to the advisory. 4 had confirmed the condition and corrected it. 1 had confirmed the condition and was mid-correction. 1 had responded to say their aircraft had already been through a re-inspection following a different bulletin and the condition had been caught and addressed. They'd known, and still sent a response to thank him for the advisory because, as their operations director had written, it confirmed we were on the right track, and that matters when you're not sure. It confirmed we were on the right track, and that matters when you're not sure. Mason had read that line 4 times. He'd printed it and put it in his desk drawer, not in any ceremonial way, but because it was the kind of thing that was worth having nearby on days when the work felt like administration rather than purpose. He was reviewing the deputy director proposal, Paul's own document, which Mason had not written or substantially revised because Paul needed to build this case in his own words for it to mean what it needed to mean. When Vanessa appeared in his doorway without a knock, which was how she appeared when she had something on her mind rather than an agenda item. "Gerald Kwan put in a formal commendation," she said. Mason looked up. "For who?" Terrence Williams. She leaned against the doorframe. Apparently, Terrence redesigned the rooftop HVAC inspection protocol, and it flagged a refrigerant issue before it became a building-wide problem. Gerald wrote it up as exceptional preventive maintenance decision-making. She paused. In Gerald's language, that's basically a medal. Mason set down the proposal. Good. Gerald also mentioned in the commendation that the protocol redesign drew on guidance from the previous maintenance lead. She looked at him with the specific quality she had when she was pointing at something she wanted him to see. He thanked you. In writing. Gerald Kwan. Mason looked at the river. It was doing its mid-August thing, which was to look as close to agreeable as it ever got. Terrence did the work, he said. I know, Vanessa said. That's not the point. He looked at her. The point, she said, is that when you left, you didn't just leave. You made sure the thing you were responsible for continued to work without you. She paused. People don't always do that. They leave, and they take the knowledge with them, and the thing degrades. You didn't. He thought about Terrence in the parking garage, about telling Gerald to look at the right person, about the documentation he'd spent 30 days doing correctly so that the people who came after him had what they needed. He'd done it because it was the right way to leave a job. He hadn't done it to make a point. It's just how you do it, he said. I know, she said. That's what I'm saying. She left him to the proposal. He sat for a moment in the particular quiet of August, the building's air conditioning system cycling through its routine, the river doing its slow thing, the city outside moving through the haze of a Tuesday that didn't know it was supposed to be significant. He thought about Carol's observation, less careful, about what it felt like to be in a position where what you actually knew was the thing being asked for, where your instinct and your experience were the point rather than the obstacle. He was honest with himself about this, suddenly transformed. He still had the habits of 4 years, the tendency to let conclusions sit before voicing them, the instinct to verify 3 times before claiming certainty, the awareness of being someone who had come to this place from somewhere unexpected and who did not take the position for granted. But the carrying was different. His mother was right. He was less careful. He was spending less energy managing how he was perceived and more energy doing the thing. These were related, he understood. You could only afford to stop performing when you trusted that the work would make the case. He picked up Paul's proposal and went back to reading. In September, Vanessa made 2 decisions in the same week that Mason understood only retrospectively as part of the same logic. The first was approving the deputy director position for Paul Weatherford, which came through HR on a Wednesday, and which Paul received with the contained but genuine reaction of someone who has been hoping for something long enough that when it arrives, the body doesn't quite know what to do with the information. He came to Mason's office afterward and stood in the doorway the way people stand when they want to say something and aren't sure of the right container for it. Thank you, he said. Simple. You built the case, Mason said. You made sure someone was looking. Mason nodded. He understood this to be the accurate accounting of what had happened, which was that both things were true and both mattered, and neither one diminished the other. The second decision was one Vanessa mentioned to Mason on a Thursday afternoon, in the kind of offhand way she used for things she'd been thinking about for a while and had already decided and was informing rather than consulting. I'm restructuring the way we do building partnerships, she said. The maintenance contract for Hargrove Tower comes up for renewal in November. I want to bring it in-house rather than third party. Mason looked at her. That's a significant operational change. It's also long overdue. We have a 30,000 square foot operation in this building. We should know our own building the way we know our own aircraft. She paused. I'd like Terrence Williams to have a conversation with our facilities director about Running Point. I'm not promising anything. It's a conversation. But if he's the right person, he is, Mason said. Immediately, without qualification. She looked at him. You're sure? I've been sure since I was in maintenance with him, he said. Terrence sees systems. He doesn't just fix the thing that's broken. He looks at why it broke and fixes that too. A pause. Give him the conversation. He'll show you. She nodded. Can you make the introduction? Yes. This was, Mason understood, not a small thing Vanessa was doing. bringing in-house a maintenance operation that had been contracted out for years, restructuring a building partnership, finding a department head from a pool of people who had been invisible to the executive floor until recently. This was the system changing. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but at the structural level where change actually holds. She was doing it because she'd learned something and was applying it rather than filing it. He thought about what she'd said on the roof after the first flight. I wasted 11 months. And what he'd said back. That it wasn't waste, that it was looking in the wrong places, that the difference mattered. He believed that. He still believed it. But he also understood that the more important thing was what you did after you understood where you'd been looking wrong, whether you adjusted the angle or just kept looking in the same direction and called it learning. She was adjusting the angle. Guamt. Lily started third grade in September with opinions about her new teacher, her classroom's location in the building, second floor, acceptable. The quality of the cafeteria grilled cheese, improved from last year, though still not achieving the diner standard, and the fact that her best friend Amara had been assigned to a different class, which she had processed with the particular stoicism of someone who has learned that unfair things happen and you can be upset about them while also continuing to function. She told Mason about all of this on the drive home on the first day with the comprehensive reporting style she brought to anything she'd experienced that she judged relevant. "How's the teacher?" Mason asked. "Mrs. Peterson, she seems okay. She has rules about pencils." "What kind of rules?" "You have to keep them sharpened. She checks." Mason considered this. "That's not unreasonable." "I know," Lily said. "I just need to know where I stand with her." She looked out the window. "How was your day?" He told her about the deputy director approval, about Paul's reaction, about Vanessa's decision to restructure the building maintenance contract. He told her at the level of detail she responded to. Not simplified, because she didn't need things simplified, but translated into terms that connected what he was doing to things she already understood. "So you're fixing how the building finds good people," she said, "like the helicopter, but for people." He was quiet for a moment. "That's one way to put it." "Is it working?" "Starting to." She watched the city go past the window. They were on the Kennedy, the late afternoon traffic thickening around them in the familiar way of a commute that you stop seeing clearly because it becomes background. He'd made this drive 4 years, from Hargrove Tower to their apartment in Pilsen, in the maintenance uniform with the gray fabric and the building logo. He made it now in the clothes of a director-level position that he still sometimes forgot to think of as his. "Dad," Lily said. "Yeah." "Do you think you would have gotten the job if the helicopter was never broken?" He thought about this honestly, the way he tried to answer her honest questions. "No," he said. "Probably not." "So it's kind of good it was broken." That's a complicated way to think about it. "But it's true," she said. Not argumentatively, just stating the arithmetic of it. He thought about 11 months, about $2.3 million, about 47 engineers and a fuel vapor condition and a 7-year-old with a stopwatch, about the specific chain of events that had to go exactly the way they went, in exactly that order, for a particular Tuesday morning in March to be the morning it was. "It's true," he said. "Yeah." She nodded, satisfied. She pulled out her library book, a new one, not about deep-sea fish, about a different subject he hadn't fully caught the title of, and read for the rest of the drive with the serene concentration of someone who has resolved the important questions and can now move on. The year turned cold again the way it always did, earlier than it should, more aggressively than was fair, with the Lake Michigan wind coming back in October like it had never left, and reminding everyone in the city that the summer's generosity was a loan, not a gift. Mason watched the river go gray again from his 41st floor window and found that he didn't mind it the way he'd minded cold things before. The window was the same window. The river was the same river. He was a different person looking at it, or the same person in a different relationship to it, which amounted to the same thing. The vendor performance review framework ran its first quarterly cycle in October. 2 contractors passed cleanly. One, not Apex, who had corrected their issues after the spring review, produced documentation that raised questions about inspection intervals, and Mason brought it to a meeting with the contractor's principal the way he brought everything, directly and without ceremony. The principal, A methodical woman named Grace Calhoun, who ran a small but solid operation and who had come to the meeting prepared to defend herself, instead spent the first 10 minutes confirming that the issues Mason had identified were real and asking what she needed to do to correct them. They spent the rest of the meeting building the correction plan together. At the end, she said, "How did you catch this? Our documentation passes standard audit every time." "Standard audit looks for what's there," Mason said. "I was looking for what was missing." She held this for a moment. Then she said, "I want to build that into our own internal review." She paused. "Would you be willing to consult?" "Not for Sterling, for us, for our internal protocols." He looked at her. "I can give you the framework we use. Your team can apply it." She said that was more than fair. She meant it. He believed her. He sent the framework to her team the following week, which cost him an hour and cost her nothing, and which meant that a small aviation maintenance firm in Chicago was going to start looking for what was missing rather than only confirming what was there, and that the aircraft that firm serviced for the 14 other operators in their client list were going to be maintained by people who had learned a different way to look. He thought about Suzanne Park in Denver, about the Atlanta charter flight and the 11 passengers who hadn't known there was anything to worry about the way a single thing done correctly ripples outward in directions you can't fully trace. He thought about how most of that rippling happens quietly, not on a rooftop, not with a stopwatch, not with 47 engineers watching, just in the ordinary work of people doing their jobs correctly and sharing what they know with people who need it. That was the thing he'd come to understand, not the 3 minutes, not the $2.3 million, not the improbable chain of events that had converted a maintenance technician into a director-level hire. Those were the surface of it, the part that made a story you could tell. The part underneath, the part that actually held, was simpler and quieter and less remarkable to watch. You knew your work. You did it correctly. You didn't wait to be important before you did it well. And when someone finally asked the right question, you answered it honestly, and you didn't make them pay for having asked it too late. That was all. That was the whole thing. Look, in November, on a Friday afternoon that was cold but clear, Mason went to the roof. He hadn't planned it. He was between things. The week's last meeting had ended early. Paul was handling the Friday operations check, and there was a gap of 40 minutes before he needed to leave to pick up Lily from her after-school program. He found himself at the stairwell door without quite having decided to go there, and he went up. The roof in November was different from the roof in March. Colder, obviously, but a different kind of cold, less aggressive, more settled. The city having made its accommodation with winter and stopped fighting it. The lake was visible today, one of those clear November days where the atmosphere decided to cooperate and you could see all the way to the blue edge of it from 58 floors up. The helicopter sat on the pad. It had flown 6 times since March. Would fly again next week when Vanessa had a site visit in Milwaukee and had decided to take the aircraft rather than the car. Mason had signed off the pre-flight inspection personally, as he did every time, because some things you didn't delegate just because you could. He stood at the edge of the helipad and looked at the machine. It was objectively unchanged. The same aircraft it had been in March, in February, in the 11 months before that when it had been called worthless scrap, an expensive sculpture, and everything between. The same turbines, the same fuel management system, the same Series C controller with its specific and rare failure mode. The same machine, fixed by the same simple procedure that had always been available to anyone who'd seen it before and knew to look for it. He thought about what it cost to not know the right question. Not in money, though the money was real. In time. In the slow accumulation of wrong answers that happens when you look in the right way in the wrong places, in what you miss while you're looking. He thought about Lily telling him the helicopter had communicated that he should have a different job, the compressed logic of an 8-year-old who had been paying attention. He thought about Carol's voice on the phone that first Tuesday evening. Mason Andre Brooks. You couldn't have told me Tuesday? He thought about Elena's notebook in his nightstand drawer. He thought about Paul writing in his notebook at every meeting, about Terrence Williams redesigning the HVAC inspection protocol, about Gerald Kwan's formal commendation, which Mason had read 3 times before putting it in the same desk drawer as the email from Denver, about 6 operators and their aircraft running clean, about Margaret Holt's formally documented objection and the fact that Mason had read it and found it professionally thorough even though he'd disagreed. He thought about what it cost to see people, not to know them, exactly, just to look in their direction long enough to register what was actually there. It wasn't a complicated calculation. It was probably the least complicated thing in any of this. You looked, you asked, you listened to the answer rather than the credential attached to the answer. You held the information without deciding in advance what shape it was allowed to take. And then you did something with what you'd seen. That was all. That was the entire thing. He stood on the roof for another few minutes while the November light moved across the city below him, doing its long afternoon thing, making everything it touched briefly more specific than it usually looked. Then he went downstairs. He picked up his daughter from her after-school program at 4:15. She came out with her backpack and her library book and her visitor badge, which she still wore even places that didn't require it, and she told him in the car about something that had happened at school involving Amara and a spelling test and a disagreement about the correct number of syllables and necessary, and he listened to all of it with the full attention it deserved, which was complete. At dinner, she told him she wanted to take flying lessons when she was old enough. He looked at her across the table. Why? She shrugged, but it was a considered shrug. I timed you. I might as well learn. He looked at his plate. He looked at her. She was eating her rice in the methodical way she ate things she was not thinking about because she was thinking about something else. The small, serious face tracking some interior calculation he could observe but not follow. He thought about Elena's notebook, about the things in it, about the version of Lily that existed in those pages. Younger, earlier, still assembling the vocabulary for the person she was going to be. He thought about who she was becoming, the specific shape of that, the bioluminescence logic and the stopwatch and the way she'd told him on a first day of school drive that the helicopter had communicated something, and it had been right. Okay, he said. She looked up. Okay, I can learn? When you're old enough, he said. We'll figure it out. She nodded once, with the satisfaction of someone who had asked a fair question and received a fair answer, and went back to her rice. Outside, the city moved through its November evening, the lights coming on in the buildings, the traffic on the streets below, the river doing its patient winter thing between its banks, the helicopter sitting on the rooftop 58 floors above everything, ready to fly. It was not a perfect story. None of the people in it were perfect. Vanessa had been wrong and had worked to stop being wrong, which was its own kind of ongoing effort that didn't arrive finished. Mason had been silent for 11 months when he might have spoken sooner, and he carried that as a lesson rather than a grievance, which was also a daily choice. Paul had spent 8 years waiting to be found before learning to be findable. Gerald had written a formal commendation like a man who'd discovered grace in paperwork, which was Gerald's version of grace, and therefore the only kind that counted. None of them had been transformed into different people by the events that had moved through their year. They were the same people doing slightly different things with what they'd learned, which was all you could actually ask of a story. Not revelation, not arrival, just the steady, incremental work of adjusting what you know against what you do, and trying to let the gap between them get smaller. The helicopter had been broken. Now it flew. Some things were exactly that simple.